30 crowns, 30 thrones, 30 kings who never saw the final betrayal coming, not from rival armies, not from scheming ministers, but from the person they shared their bed with. From ancient Greece to the last days of Byzantium, we are diving into history's most intimate assassinations, where love curdled into ambition. And the deadliest weapon wasn't the sword, it was the kiss goodnight. This is 30 kings who were murdered by their spouse, and every one of them thought they were safe. Before we dive in, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of history's darkest stories. And while you're here, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is right now. Let's see just how far, and how late, this tale of royal betrayal can travel. Agamemnon. The sea had been cruel to the Greeks. 10 years of war under the burning sky of Troy, and then a homecoming as long and bitter as the fighting itself. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, returned at last. The salt still crusted in his beard, his armor dented by the fists of 1,000 battles. The city gates opened to him with ceremony, but behind the fanfare was the shadow of a woman's gaze, his wife, Clytemnestra, who had not forgiven, not forgotten, and not repented of her rage. Agamemnon had left her with a wound deeper than any spear could carve. When the fleet first set sail for Troy, there had been no wind. The Greek army waited, restless, on the shores of Aulis, until a prophet whispered a terrible solution. Sacrifice your daughter Iphigenia, and the gods will give you wind. And so Agamemnon did. Not even the golden crown on his head could soften the choice. The ships departed on a tide of blood, but Clytemnestra was left with a grave and an emptiness where her child had been. In the years that followed, she rebuilt herself into steel. She took a lover, Aegisthus, and together they plotted. The war in Troy would end one day, and when it did, the king who came home would not live to see another sunrise. When Agamemnon entered the palace, it was all ritual and honeyed words. Clytemnestra spread purple cloth beneath his feet, a costly gesture meant for gods, not men. She told him it was to honor him. In truth, it was to mark the spot where blood would fall. He walked across the fabric like a man stepping into his own shroud. Some say she waited until he was in the bath, steam curling from the water, the bronze tub gleaming under torchlight, the weight of war finally slipping from his shoulders. That's when she struck, either with a dagger plunged deep into his chest or an axe swung with both hands, depending on which ancient poet you believe. Either way, the blow was not just murder, it was the closing of a debt. Others tell a variation, that she entangled him in a net before striking, trapping the once great commander like a fish gasping on a deck. The details shift with the storyteller, but the ending is always the same. Agamemnon's body crumpled, the water turning red, his voice gone forever. The Mycenaean court would remember this as more than just a killing. This was a message, carved in bone and blood. No king, no matter how mighty, can outrun the vengeance of his own household. The gods, after all, delight in irony. The aftermath was pure chaos. Clytemnestra and Aegisthus ruled, but they ruled under a curse. The children of Agamemnon, Orestes, and Electra grew up with the knowledge that their mother had murdered their father, and in the cycle of Greek tragedy, there is no wound without retaliation. Years later, Orestes would return to Mycenae, sword in hand, and the palace floors would run red again, this time with the blood of Clytemnestra herself. But the killing of Agamemnon was more than a domestic tragedy. It was a reminder of the fragility of kingship in the Bronze Age. The same war that made his name a legend had also weakened him, stripped him of allies, and left him vulnerable. When he sailed home, it wasn't just to a wife, he returned to a trap, carefully laid for over a decade. The city of Mycenae carried on, its stone lions still standing at the gate. But something had shifted. The king had been brought down not by an enemy spear on the battlefield, but by the hand of the woman who once shared his bed. In that act, Clytemnestra had claimed a different kind of power, one that did not rely on armies or crowns, but on patience, cunning, and the element of surprise. In the ancient world, such a murder was not just a crime, it was a cosmic imbalance. The Furies, those dark spirits of vengeance, were said to rise from the underworld to hound those guilty of spilling family blood. Whether you believe in the gods or not, the Mycenaeans certainly did. And in their eyes, Clytemnestra had bought herself a lifetime of torment, whether in this world or the next. Agamemnon's story was sung by bards for centuries, each version a little bloodier, a little more theatrical than the last. The image of the warlord stripped of armor, trapped in his own home, cut down by the one person who should have been his safe harbor, was too potent to fade. And yet, his death was not unique. In the annals of history, the list of kings who have met their end at the hands of a spouse is disturbingly long. From the palaces of the ancient Aegean to the courts of pharaohs along the Nile, marriage has been as much a political weapon as any sword. Which brings us to another king who learned too late that his own bed could be more dangerous than the battlefield, this one wearing the crown of Egypt and facing a conspiracy so intricate it would be remembered for 3,000 years. Ramesses III. The heat in Thebes was different from the dry winds of the desert. It pressed down on the palace walls, heavy with the smell of lotus blossoms and the faint rot of the Nile's slow water. Ramesses III, the last great pharaoh of Egypt's new kingdom, sat on the throne of his ancestors, as if he were carved from the same granite as the colossal statues of his forebears. He had fought off Libyan raiders, crushed invaders from the sea, and held the empire together through decades of unrest. He was a king who had survived everything except the people who shared his roof. By the time the plot against him began, Ramesses was not a young man. His long reign had drained Egypt's treasury and tested its patience. Behind the painted columns of his palace, a power struggle was brewing, not in the open court, where scribes recorded royal decrees, but in the shadowed apartments of the harem. The word harem carries an image of silk and perfume, but in Egypt, it was as much a political machine as a pleasure hall. Dozens of wives and concubines, each with their own attendants, formed an intricate web of alliances and rivalries. The women were not merely ornaments, they were political players, and their children were pawns in a game of succession. Tiye, one of Ramesses' lesser wives, decided she would not remain lesser forever. Her son Pentawere was not the designated heir. That honor belonged to Ammon, her Kepeshef, the son of the great royal wife Isis. But Tiye was ambitious, and in the slow-burning politics of the harem, ambition was a weapon sharper than bronze. The conspiracy that followed became known much later as the Harem Conspiracy. It was not a crime of passion, but a carefully plotted coup. Tiye and her allies, servants, scribes, guards, even magicians, formed a network with one goal: remove Ramesses and put Pentawere on the throne. They prepared in layers. First, they spread discontent among the palace staff. They whispered about the king's age, his inability to lead Egypt into a new golden era. They sowed doubts in the minds of soldiers, and then they turned to more direct methods, spells and poisons. In ancient Egypt, the two were often indistinguishable. An incantation might be uttered over a cup of wine, and the death that followed could be called divine justice. The plan was meant to unfold quietly: kill the king, install the prince, lock down the capital before anyone could resist. But coups are rarely as smooth as they look on papyrus. Somewhere in the machinery of betrayal, a cog slipped. The plot was discovered perhaps by a loyal servant, perhaps by an informant who decided their loyalty was worth more than their life. The conspirators were dragged into the open, and for a moment it seemed as if Ramesses had survived. But here's where history turns sly. For centuries, Egyptologists believed Ramesses died later of natural causes. His mummy showed no obvious wounds. The official records spoke of a trial, one of the most detailed in ancient history, where the conspirators were found guilty and executed or forced to commit suicide. Pentawere himself was allegedly allowed to choose his own death, strangling himself with a length of linen. It wasn't until modern forensic studies that the truth came creeping back like a snake from the reeds. CT scans of the pharaoh's mummy revealed something chilling. His throat had been cut, deep enough to sever major blood vessels and the trachea. The wound was lethal. Even in the afterlife, his killers had left their signature. That meant the conspiracy had not failed entirely. Ramesses had been murdered almost certainly as part of TA's plot. The trial had been not a prelude to the killing, but an aftershock. The vengeance of those who had lost in the scramble for the throne. The harem conspiracy, papyri that survived, tell the story in fragments, lists of names, accounts of magical rituals, testimony wrung from trembling lips. You can almost hear the desperation of the conspirators as they describe making wax figurines of the king to curse him, or smuggling messages wrapped in cloth. Some of them probably believed their cause was just. After all, in the politics of the palace, justice was simply whatever kept you alive. For Ramesses, the irony was bitter. He had defended Egypt against foreign enemies for 3 decades, only to be cut down in his own home by a wife who wanted her son to wear his crown. His monuments still stand, carved deep into stone walls, the Medinet Habu temple bearing reliefs of him smiting enemies, larger than life. But those carvings don't tell you about the last moments of the man himself, about the steel in TA's eyes, or the sudden cold as a blade sliced the air in front of him. After his death, Egypt would never quite recover. The succession crisis fractured the royal court, and the empire slid further into decline. The grandeur of the new kingdom faded into memory, and Ramesses III became both a warning and a legend, a ruler who could command armies, but not his own household. The papyri end with the execution of the guilty, but they don't tell you about the quiet after the trials. The way the palace halls must have echoed with absence. The women of the harem would have been reshuffled, their rooms sealed or reassigned. The young heirs would have been watched more closely. And yet, in that silence, the truth lingered. The king was gone, and it was the people closest to him who had sent him to the gods. And if you think Egypt was alone in that kind of treachery, think again. Across the wine-dark sea, another monarch would learn that the greatest danger sometimes comes not from a distant army, but from the one who shares your bed, a king whose death would shake the foundations of an empire still young, and leave the world wondering whether it was fate or a wife's whispered order that pushed the dagger in. Philip II of Macedon. The wedding hall was brimming with wine, music, and the self-satisfied glow of a king who had everything. Philip II of Macedon, general, conqueror, father to the most famous man who would ever walk the ancient world, was celebrating yet another marriage. This one, to Cleopatra Eurydice, was his 7th or 8th, depending on which chronicler you ask. In Philip's world, wives were not just romantic partners, they were political chess pieces, traded for alliances and territory. But this particular union was more than politics. It was also a spark thrown into a powder keg. For in the shadows of the feast stood Olympias, Philip's other wife, the one who had given him Alexander. Olympias was not a woman to be underestimated. Her bloodline ran back to the Molossian kings of Epirus. Her temper was the stuff of legend, her charm a weapon, her devotion to her son unshakable. And at that wedding feast, she saw something she would not forgive. Cleopatra's uncle, Attalus, drunken with celebration, raised his cup and made a toast to the hope that Philip's new union would produce a legitimate heir, pointedly implying that Alexander, son of Olympias, was somehow less than royal. The insult hung in the air like a knife. Alexander, barely a man, rose in fury and shouted back. The room split into factions, and Philip, the great strategist, tried to stride across the hall to his son, only to stumble and fall. The scene was humiliating, and the wound it left in the royal family was deep. Olympias withdrew to Epirus soon after, taking Alexander with her. The marriage to Cleopatra had planted seeds of division, and Macedon was a land where seeds could grow into daggers very quickly. Philip was not just a domestic player. He was an architect of empire. Through a mixture of military brilliance and ruthless politics, he had united the fractious Greek city-states under his rule, laying the groundwork for the campaigns his son would one day complete. But in 336 BCE, just as he was preparing to lead an invasion of Persia, he returned to Aegae for a wedding, this time not his own, but that of his daughter, Cleopatra. Yes, another Cleopatra, because ancient Macedon had all the creativity of a Netflix prequel when it came to names. It was supposed to be a day of triumph. The wedding was a diplomatic masterstroke, sealing an alliance with Epirus. The theatre at Aegae was packed with guests. Guards lined the aisles. The king walked in wearing white robes, a garland of flowers around his head, basking in the applause of his subjects. And then came Pausanias. Pausanias was one of Philip's bodyguards, a man who had once been close to the king, but a series of slights and humiliations had soured that closeness. Whether his personal grievance was enough to drive him to murder, or whether he was nudged along by whispers from Olympias, or even Alexander himself, remains one of history's most tantalizing uncertainties. What we do know is this. As Philip approached the crowd, Pausanias stepped forward, drew a blade, and drove it into the king. The strike was clean, deliberate. Philip collapsed before he could reach the stage. In an instant, the air in the theatre shifted from celebration to chaos. Pausanias turned and ran toward the city gates, but the other bodyguards caught him and cut him down before he could speak. And just like that, Macedon had no king. In the immediate aftermath, suspicion curled like smoke through the court. Olympias returned from Epirus with unnerving speed. She wasted no time in consolidating power for Alexander. Within months, Cleopatra Eurydice, Philip's new wife, was dead, along with her infant child. The stories say Olympias personally oversaw their deaths, as if tying off loose threads in a tapestry she intended her son to inherit. Was Olympias truly the mastermind behind Philip's assassination? Ancient historians differ. Some present it as a personal vendetta, revenge for the insult at the wedding feast years earlier, or for Philip's abandonment. Others see it as cold political calculus, remove Philip before he could father more sons with Cleopatra, and potentially push Alexander aside. In either case, the convenience of the timing is impossible to ignore. Philip's death was not just a family matter, it was a geopolitical earthquake. His plans to invade Persia fell into Alexander's hands. The same army that had followed Philip for decades now rallied behind his son. And Alexander, for all his youth, wasted no time proving himself. But in the echoes of his first victories, the question lingered. Was Alexander's rise built on a murder his own mother ordered? Olympias never admitted anything, but her later actions suggest a woman perfectly comfortable with blood on her hands. She was ruthless in securing her son's throne, eliminating rivals with an efficiency that would have impressed any assassin. Philip II's legacy is often overshadowed by Alexander's legend, but without him, there would have been no empire stretching from Greece to India. He was the builder, the unifier, the king who turned Macedon from a backwater into a powerhouse, and yet, for all his military genius, he could not see the dagger coming from within his own circle. The irony is sharp. Philip had spent his life anticipating the moves of foreign enemies, studying their strategies, breaking their alliances. He could march an army across hostile terrain with clockwork precision. But the human heart, particularly the heart of a wronged wife, was terrain he could never master. And so, in the end, the man who dreamed of conquering Persia was conquered instead by palace intrigue. His blood pooled on the stones of Aige, the wedding music fading into shouts, and somewhere Olympias must have smiled. But if you think Philip's end was dramatic, the next ruler in our tale makes even this seem almost polite. Imagine an emperor whose own wife may have served him his final meal, not in the heat of a quarrel, but as part of a cold, calculated plan to place her son on the throne of the greatest empire on earth. The dining table, it turns out, can be every bit as lethal as the battlefield. Emperor Claudius. The last night of Claudius's life may have begun like so many others in the imperial palace, under the steady glow of oil lamps, the murmuring of attendants, and the faint rustle of the silk curtains that shielded the emperor's private rooms from the marble corridors outside. Claudius was not the kind of ruler Rome expected to survive long in power. In fact, when he first stumbled onto the throne in 41 CE, quite literally stumbled, dragged from behind a curtain by the Praetorian Guard after the assassination of Caligula, few believed he would last a year. He had been mocked his entire life for his limp, his stammer, and his habit of drooling when excited. The court whispered that he was slow-witted, unfit for rule. But Claudius had proved them wrong. Behind the awkward gait and the shuffling speech was a cunning mind and an iron will. He had expanded Rome's empire into Britain, reformed the legal system, and restored the treasury. And yet, for all his political survival skills, Claudius was fatally naive in one area: his family. His wife, Agrippina the Younger, had married him not out of love, but out of ambition, sharpened to a blade's edge. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and she knew how to wield her lineage like a weapon. She also came with a son from a previous marriage, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, whom the world would one day know as Nero. Claudius already had his own heir, Britannicus, the child of his previous wife, Messalina. But Agrippina had no intention of letting the throne pass to someone outside her bloodline. She set about her project with the precision of a general planning a siege. First, she charmed the emperor, flattery, deference, careful shows of loyalty. Then she maneuvered her allies into key positions in the palace, ensuring that her voice would be heard in every corner of imperial policy. She persuaded Claudius to adopt Nero as his son, giving him equal claim to the throne. And when the adoption ceremony was complete, she turned her attention to the final obstacle: Claudius himself. Ancient sources disagree on the details, but they agree on the core truth: Agrippina poisoned him. Whether the deed was done at a feast or during a private meal is a matter for historians to argue. One version says the fatal dish was mushrooms, Claudius's favorite delicacy. Agrippina may have ordered the imperial cook, a man named Halotus, to prepare them with a dose of a particularly lethal toxin. The emperor ate, praised the dish, and within hours was racked by pain. Some accounts claim the poison worked slowly, and when it failed to kill him outright, Agrippina ordered another dose disguised as medicine. The doctor, Xenophon, supposedly administered it by slipping a poisoned feather into Claudius's throat under the guise of helping him vomit. If the first attack was subtle, the second was ruthless. Claudius died in the early hours of the 13th of October, 54 CE. He was 63 years old, having ruled for 13 years. In the official proclamations, his death was presented as natural, a peaceful passing of the beloved emperor into the company of the gods. The Senate even deified him, turning Claudius into a god on paper, if not in anyone's heart. But in the whispers of the palace and the writings of chroniclers like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, the truth was clear enough. Agrippina had cleared the path for Nero. Her success was immediate. Nero, only 16 years old, was declared emperor the very same day Claudius died. Britannicus, still a boy, was sidelined. Within a year, he too would be dead poisoned, most likely on Nero's orders, during a banquet. Agrippina had gotten what she wanted, but the boy she placed on the throne would one day turn against her with the same cold efficiency she had once turned on her husband. The murder of Claudius reveals something fundamental about the politics of Rome. Power was not simply taken on the battlefield. It was taken at the dinner table, in whispered conversations, in the private quarters where no historian could stand and take notes. Rome's empire was built on marble and blood, but the blood often came first from the emperor's own cup. Agrippina's choice of method poison was almost an art form in Roman politics. Unlike the quick brutality of a sword, poison offered deniability. Symptoms could mimic illness. A body could be buried before questions were asked. And in a palace where dozens of dishes passed through dozens of hands every day, it was easy to hide a death inside a meal. But poison was also a statement. It told the victim, and everyone else, that the killer was close enough to feed you, to pour your wine, to stroke your hand as they watched you die. Agrippina's alleged crime was not just a bid for power, it was a demonstration that the emperor was never beyond reach, no matter how high the throne. Claudius, for all his intelligence and survival instincts, had trusted the wrong person. He had believed he could control Agrippina, that he could use her political instincts without becoming a victim of them. But the moment she saw her chance to replace him with Nero, his fate was sealed. The irony is almost theatrical. Claudius had ascended to power after the assassination of his predecessor. His reign had been haunted by palace intrigue from the very beginning, and yet he failed to recognize the final act of his own tragedy until it was far too late. And so, the man who brought Britain into Rome's empire ended his days not on the battlefield or in the Senate, but choking in his own chambers, betrayed by the woman who shared his bed. But if you think Claudius's death was the ultimate in imperial betrayal, you haven't yet met his successor in our tale, a Roman ruler whose end came not from the quiet slip of poison, but from the sharp edge of a soldier's blade, driven in under the open sky, with rumors swirling that his own mistress may have lit the fuse. Emperor Caracalla. The road to Carrhae stretched wide and dusty under the Syrian sun, the kind of road a Roman emperor could travel without fear, at least in theory. Caracalla had been emperor for more than a decade, his reign marked by brutality, paranoia, and a talent for making enemies faster than he could eliminate them. He was the son of Septimius Severus, heir to a dynasty that had clawed its way to the purple in the chaos after Commodus's death. He had fought alongside his father in the east, learned to command armies, and then after his father's death, learned how to command Rome with the edge of a sword. But Caracalla was not a man who ruled through love, he ruled through fear. One of his first acts as sole emperor was to murder his younger brother Geta in their mother's arms, splattering her robes with blood. He then ordered the execution of anyone who had sided with Geta 20,000 people, according to some chroniclers. Rome's streets ran slick with the blood of senators, officers, and anyone unfortunate enough to have been polite to the wrong brother. The empire under Caracalla was a paradox. On the one hand, he expanded the Roman citizenship to almost all free men in the empire, a move historians still debate as either a progressive gesture or a cynical tax grab. On the other hand, he emptied the treasury on lavish spending, military campaigns, and personal vanity projects, like the enormous baths of Caracalla, a sprawling monument to his own name. But for all his cruelty and arrogance, Caracalla was not invincible. The danger came not from the front lines of war, but from the people closest to him, those who shared his tent, his meals, and his secrets. In 217 CE, Caracalla was leading an army eastward in preparation for a campaign against Parthia. His reputation as a soldier emperor was important to him. He liked to march on foot with his troops, to share their hardships, to present himself as one of them. It was a calculated performance, but it also meant he travelled more exposed than most emperors. He had with him a mistress, Julia Domna, the widow of his father, and his stepmother, a relationship that was already the stuff of scandal in Rome. Julia was not just a companion, she was a political figure in her own right, intelligent, ambitious, and deeply enmeshed in the affairs of the court. But she was also surrounded by factions, and in those factions were men who saw in Caracalla's death an opportunity. The man who ultimately struck the blow was a soldier named Justin Martialis, a member of the imperial bodyguard. The official story goes like this. On the 8th of April, Caracalla stopped by the roadside during the journey to relieve himself. Seizing the moment, Martialis stepped forward and stabbed him from behind, the blade sliding between the ribs. Caracalla collapsed in the dust, and the Emperor of Rome, who had survived battlefields and palace plots, was left bleeding in the dirt of a provincial road. Why did Martialis do it? Theories swarm like flies around the corpse of the story. Some say it was a personal grievance, that Martialis had been denied a promotion. Others whisper that the murder was orchestrated by Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect who had everything to gain from the emperor's death. He became emperor himself within days. And still others point toward the influence of Julia Domna's allies, suggesting that the web of relationships between Caracalla, his stepmother mistress, and the court's competing factions had spun too tight to hold. What's certain is that the assassination was no chaotic street killing. Martialis was cut down almost immediately by other guards, which ensured he could never speak publicly about his reasons. And Macrinus, the man who stepped into the purple, wasted no time securing the loyalty of the legions, something he could only have done if at least part of the military elite had been in on the plan. The news of Caracalla's death spread quickly, and reactions were mixed. To the soldiers who had marched with him, he was a commander who shared their hardships, ate their rations, and slept on the same ground. To the Senate and the people of Rome, he was a tyrant, a fratricide, and a man whose temper could destroy a life in a heartbeat. Even his burial carried irony. He was cremated and deified, as Roman custom demanded, turned into a god by the same system that had been powerless to save his mortal life. Statues of him still stood in the cities of the empire, his face chiseled in stone, calm, serene, nothing like the man who had raged and ruled with a soldier's brutality. Caracalla's murder fit into a grim pattern in Roman politics. Emperors rarely died in bed. Poison, blades, accidents. During hunts, these were the tools of imperial succession. The palace was as dangerous as any battlefield, and often more so, because here the enemy could smile at you over dinner before slipping a dagger into your back. If Caracalla suspected betrayal, he didn't suspect it soon enough. The man who had slaughtered his own brother without hesitation had failed to see the knife coming from behind. Perhaps he trusted his guards too much, or perhaps he simply believed that fear would keep them loyal. But fear is a fickle currency. The moment someone else offers more power, more gold, more survival, loyalty can turn on a single step, a single moment when the emperor looks the wrong way. The empire rolled on without him, as it always did, but each assassination left a mark. The people knew their rulers could fall at any moment, and the rulers knew it too. That knowledge bred more paranoia, more purges, more desperate grabs for power. And so the road to Cari became more than just the place where one man died. It was another mile marker on Rome's long, bloody highway of betrayal. And ahead, not far in the distance, another emperor was about to discover that even the throne of the world's greatest empire could not shield him from the fatal combination of ambition and a spouse's lethal whisper. This next ruler would meet his end not in a dusty roadside ambush, but in a final, brutal act of intimate betrayal inside the heart of the imperial palace itself. Emperor Commodus. If Rome had a weirdest emperor contest, Commodus wouldn't just win, he'd bring his own laurel wreath and make everyone call him the new Hercules before accepting the prize. The son of Marcus Aurelius, Commodus inherited an empire that was still strong, wealthy, and mostly stable. He also inherited none of his father's stoic self-control. Where Marcus Aurelius had been a philosopher king, Commodus was, well, the kind of man who thought it was a good idea to show up in the Colosseum, dressed in lion skins and a club, pretending to be Hercules reborn. The first years of his reign were almost normal. Marcus Aurelius had groomed him for rule, and competent ministers handled the real work. But power mixed with Commodus's ego was a dangerous cocktail. He increasingly withdrew from state business, leaving it to favorites and sycophants, while he chased pleasures and staged gladiatorial bouts where, unsurprisingly, he always won. His opponents in the arena were often maimed or armed with blunted weapons. Rome laughed in private and clapped in public, because laughing out loud at the emperor could get you executed. But Commodus wasn't content with being emperor. He wanted to be worshipped as a living god. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, Colony of Commodus, and the months of the year after his own titles. Statues depicted him as Hercules, the club-wielding hero. Coins bore his divine likeness. The Senate tolerated it all with gritted teeth. Over time, the paranoia set in. Commodus began purging senators, ministers, and even friends on the suspicion of disloyalty. A rumor was enough to see a man's head on the executioner's block. His circle shrank until it was composed almost entirely of flatterers and a few people who smiled at him in the day and plotted against him at night. One of those people was his mistress, Marcia. Marcia was no naive concubine. She was politically savvy and close to key figures in the Praetorian Guard. She had influence, but influence under Commodus was fragile. In 192 CE, Commodus made the fatal mistake of putting her name on an execution list. The reasons are murky. Maybe she offended him. Maybe she refused him. Maybe it was simply his growing distrust of everyone. When Marcia discovered the list, she did not wait for the executioner's knock at her door. She moved first. The conspiracy was simple but precise. Marcia teamed up with Eclectus, the chamberlain, and Quintus Aemilius Laetus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. These were not minor players. They controlled access to the emperor and the armed force that protected him. The plan was to kill Commodus quietly, make it look like a natural death, and ensure the transition to a safer successor. On the evening of the 31st of December, 192, Commodus returned from the baths. He was in a good mood. The next day he planned to appear in the Colosseum as a gladiator for the New Year's festivities. This was no mere performance. He intended to fight in the arena every day thereafter, as if the empire could be governed from the sand of the amphitheater. It was the last straw for the conspirators. Marcia poured him a cup of wine laced with poison. He drank. At first, it seemed to work. Commodus began to feel ill, retching and staggering. But Commodus was physically strong and stubborn, and the poison alone wasn't finishing the job fast enough. If he vomited it out, their plan would fail and their names would be next on the list. That's when they called in Narcissus. Narcissus was a professional wrestler and trainer, one of Commodus's athletic companions. He was summoned under the pretense of helping the emperor recover. Instead, when Narcissus entered the room, he grabbed the emperor from behind and strangled him, using either a cord or his bare arms, depending on which historian you read. Commodus, the man who fancied himself a god and Rome's greatest gladiator, died in his bath chamber, not on the sands of the Colosseum. The aftermath was swift. The conspirators proclaimed Pertinax as emperor, presenting Commodus's death as a natural passing. The Senate, which had long despised him, celebrated publicly. Statues of Commodus were torn down, inscriptions erased, and his name cursed in the official records. It was as if Rome collectively decided to pretend the last 12 years had been a bad dream. Yet the city could not entirely erase the memory of him. Commodus had been absurd, yes, but also dangerous, a reminder that the most destructive emperors were often the ones who thought themselves untouchable. His reign marked the end of the Pax Romana, the long period of relative peace and stability that had begun with Augustus. After his death, Rome would plunge into the Year of the Five Emperors, a time of civil war and political chaos. For Marcia, the choice to kill him was as much about survival as politics. In Commodus's Rome, proximity to the emperor was a double-edged sword. One day you might be dining with him, the next you might be on his death list. She had simply made sure the blade swung in the other direction first. Commodus's murder fits a pattern we've already seen: the lethal intimacy of a spouse or lover's betrayal. There is no place more dangerous for a ruler than their own inner circle, where smiles hide knives and affection masks ambition. Poison and strangulation are not battlefield tactics. They are the weapons of the bedroom and the banquet hall, where the first sign of danger is also the last. And as the 2nd century gave way to the 3rd, Rome was about to learn that this kind of assassination would not fade away. Another emperor would fall, not in the bathhouse or the gladiators' arena, but on the open streets of the capital, cut down by his own officers, in a plot that some say bore the fingerprints of his wife. The empire's greatest danger was still not the barbarians at the gates, but the people waiting at home. Emperor Valentinian III. The spring air in Rome carried the scent of blossoms from the Tiber's banks, but in the heart of the Western Roman Empire, the sweet fragrance was laced with the stench of political rot. By 455 CE, The empire was barely a shadow of what it had been. The legions that once thundered across continents now struggled to defend the frontiers. Germanic tribes pressed on all sides, and in the middle of this unraveling tapestry sat Emperor Valentinian III, a man who had worn the purple for 30 years, yet never truly held the reins. Valentinian had come to the throne as a child, placed there after a dizzying carousel of intrigue and power plays in the imperial court. His early reign had been dominated by the towering figure of Flavius Aetius, the last of the Romans, the general who had saved the West from Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. But as Valentinian grew older, he bristled under Aetius's shadow. Rome was his, and yet his name was always spoken second, after the generals. In 454 CE, that tension exploded. Aetius, visiting the imperial palace for what he thought was a routine meeting, was accused of treachery by Valentinian himself. The emperor, in a rare moment of decisive violence, drew his sword and struck the general down with his own hand, aided by a few courtiers. Aetius's blood had barely dried before the political fallout began. The murder of the empire's most capable commander had shocked the court and terrified the army. And yet, if Valentinian thought killing Aetius would make him stronger, he was mistaken. In reality, he had just torn out the spine of the empire's military command. More importantly, he had alienated the very men who guarded him. Among those alienated was Petronius Maximus, a senator with ambitions sharper than a gladius. Maximus had once hoped to marry Licenia Eudoxia, the emperor's wife, but Valentinian had taken her instead. The insult festered for years. The murder of Aetius gave Maximus his opening, a chance to avenge his personal grievance, seize the throne, and perhaps claim Eudoxia as his own. Licenia Eudoxia herself was not without motive. She had been married to Valentinian since she was a girl, and their union was more political contract than romance. Rumors swirled that she despised her husband's cruelty and suspected him of infidelity. Some later sources suggest she may have resented him enough to support Maximus's plot, or at least turn a blind eye to it. On the 16th of March, 455 CE, Valentinian left the palace to practice archery in the field of Mars. It was a day like any other, and perhaps that was why he brought only a small guard detail. As he dismounted his horse, two men approached. They were Optila and Thraustila, officers in the imperial bodyguard, both former soldiers under Aetius. Their loyalty to the dead general outweighed any oath to the living emperor. As Valentinian bent his bow, Optila struck first, stabbing him in the side. Thraustila followed with another blow. The emperor collapsed to the ground, his hands scrambling in the dirt. Witnesses said he tried to rise, but the wounds were mortal. By the time the guards realized what was happening, it was already over. The Emperor of the West lay dead, blood soaking the field where moments before he had been laughing and drawing arrows from his quiver. The assassins made no attempt to flee. They didn't have to. Maximus was ready. Within hours, he was proclaimed emperor, stepping into the power vacuum with a speed that betrayed long preparation. Valentinian's body was left almost as an afterthought, a symbolic casualty in the endless, grinding collapse of the Western Empire. The question of Licenia Eudoxia's role remains one of those tantalizing mysteries of late Roman history. Chroniclers hostile to her claimed she invited the Vandals to sack Rome later that same year, seeking revenge on Maximus for forcing her into marriage after Valentinian's death. If that's true, then the death of Valentinian was only the first in a chain reaction that would burn the city's name into history for its second great sack. Whether or not she actively plotted her husband's murder, Eudoxia's silence after the fact spoke volumes. She did nothing to protect his memory, nothing to punish his killers. For a woman who had once been at the center of the imperial court, her detachment was conspicuous and politically useful to Maximus, who could parade her presence at his side as a sign of legitimacy. Valentinian III's assassination was not just the death of an emperor, it was the death rattle of the Western Roman Empire. Without Aetius, without Valentinian, and with the Vandals on the horizon, the West slid ever faster into fragmentation. The imperial palace in Ravenna and the Senate in Rome were still there, but their words had no weight. The real power was in the hands of generals, warlords, and kings who no longer needed Rome's approval to rule. Looking back, Valentinian was not remembered as a tyrant like Commodus or a builder like Claudius, but as something worse in the eyes of Roman historians, a weak ruler. In an age when the empire needed iron will and military genius, he brought neither. His final act of initiative, killing Aetius, destroyed his own security. His last breath on the field of Mars was the echo of an empire hollowed out from within. But even as the West crumbled, the East remained strong, and in far-off China, emperors still ruled with the kind of absolute authority Rome had once commanded. Yet there, too, the shadow of the inner court loomed. It would not be long before a ruler on the other side of the world learned that no emperor, no matter how high his walls, could protect himself from the deadly ambition of a concubine with poison in her sleeve. Emperor Gaozu of Northern Qi, Gao Cheng. In the middle of the 6th century, northern China was a land split by rival dynasties, their borders shifting like sand in a windstorm. Among the most powerful of these was Northern Qi, a state forged out of warlords and palace schemers, where the man on the throne was as likely to die in his sleep from a coup as on the battlefield. Into this dangerous theater stepped Gao Cheng, better known posthumously as Emperor Gaozu of Northern Qi. Gao Cheng's rise had been as bloody as the age demanded. Born the eldest son of Gao Huan, the de facto ruler of Eastern Wei, Gao Cheng was bred for power. His father was the real power behind the Eastern Wei throne, a military strongman who held the emperor in his pocket. When Gao Huan died in 547 CE, the weight of the family's power passed to Gao Cheng. Though still young, he inherited the armies, the court factions, and the dangerous game of controlling a puppet emperor. But Gao Cheng was not content to remain the power behind the curtain. The puppet on the throne was Emperor Xiaojing of Eastern Wei, and Gao Cheng was determined to replace him entirely. He ruled in all but name, issuing decrees, appointing officials, and dealing harshly with rivals. His rule was marked by a combination of charisma and cruelty. He could charm an ally over wine one night and have them executed the next morning if they whispered the wrong thing. Like many rulers of the era, Gao Cheng surrounded himself with a harem of wives and concubines. These women were more than ornaments. They were pawns, spies, and sometimes weapons in the endless contest for influence inside the palace walls. Each came from a family that might rise or fall depending on her favor, and every woman in the inner court knew the stakes. Among them was a concubine named Zheng. Little is known about her early life, but by the time history records her, she was already in Gao Cheng's bed and in his confidence. Whether she came to love him or merely tolerate him is lost to time. What is certain is that her relationship with Gao Cheng would end in one of the most infamous acts of intimate betrayal in Northern Qi's short, violent history. The reasons for Zheng's decision to murder Gao Cheng remain the subject of speculation. Some accounts suggest that she had been slighted, perhaps demoted in favor of another concubine, or insulted in front of the court. Others hint at political intrigue, with Zheng acting as the instrument of a faction that wanted Gao Cheng gone before he could take the throne outright. In a court where every gesture could shift alliances, a personal quarrel could easily become a political assassination. The killing itself was simple, almost anticlimactic for such a dramatic stage. In the spring of 549 CE, Gao Cheng was relaxing in the private quarters of the palace. He trusted Zheng enough to eat the food she offered him without hesitation. That trust was his undoing. The dish, perhaps wine, perhaps something more solid, was laced with poison. Gao Cheng began to feel the effects almost immediately. The numbness, the constriction in his chest, the growing weakness in his limbs, all hallmarks of the deadly compounds used in palace murders for centuries. By the time his attendants realized something was wrong, it was too late. Gao Cheng collapsed, unable to summon the strength to call for help. The man who had controlled armies and bent an emperor to his will died on the cushions of his own chamber, killed not by an enemy's sword but by the hands of a woman he had once embraced. The reaction in the court was a mixture of shock and inevitability. This was Northern Qi, after all, a place where rulers rose and fell with frightening speed, and where poison was an accepted method of political transition. Gao Cheng's death cleared the way for his younger brother Gao Yang to seize power. Gao Yang would go on to depose Emperor Xiaojing and declare himself the first true emperor of Northern Qi. In that sense, Zheng's act did not just end a man's life, it reshaped the dynasty's trajectory. What became of Zheng after the assassination is not well recorded. In many such cases, the killer might be executed immediately, or, if she had powerful backers, quietly removed from the court to live in obscurity. Given the speed with which Gao Yang moved to consolidate power, it is possible that Zheng was either rewarded for her role or eliminated to tie up loose ends. In the brutal calculus of the Northern Qi court, her fate would have been determined by whether she remained useful to those in power. The story of Gao Cheng's murder is a reminder of how deeply personal the politics of the Chinese imperial courts could be. Armies and battles decided the borders, but within the palace, wars were fought with glances, rumors, and cups of wine. A ruler might survive campaigns against rival states only to be undone by the quiet venom of his own bedchamber. Gao Cheng's life and death also show the paradox of power in such a system. The closer one came to absolute authority, the narrower the circle of trust became. By the end, a ruler could rely only on a handful of people, and those were the very people with the best opportunity to kill him. And Gao Cheng was not alone in meeting his end this way. The chronicles of China's dynastic past are littered with emperors who trusted too much, who underestimated the ambitions or resentments of the women in their inner courts. One of them, ruling more than a century later in the Tang dynasty, would find that his own wife was not content to be the power behind the throne. She would take the throne itself, and the first step in doing so was to clear it of the man sitting there. The poison in that story would be poured with a steady hand and a smile that gave nothing away. Emperor Zhongzong of Tang. The Tang dynasty was, in many ways, the high noon of imperial China. Its borders stretched wide, its capital Chang'an glittered with wealth and culture, and its court was a web of intrigue so tangled that even seasoned statesmen could vanish into it without a trace. In this sprawling empire, Emperor Zhongzong's reign was one of interruptions, restorations, and, ultimately, a death that many believe was brewed in his own teacup by the woman he shared his life with. Zhongzong was not born to command with an iron hand. He was the son of Emperor Gaozu and the formidable Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to rule in her own name as emperor. Being her son was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it meant an imperial pedigree beyond dispute. On the other, it meant living in the shadow of a mother whose political will could break the strongest men. He first ascended the throne in 684 CE after Gaozong's death, but his reign lasted barely 6 weeks before Wu Zetian deposed him for showing signs of independence. She replaced him with his younger brother, sending Zhongzong into a comfortable but powerless exile. For years, he waited in the provinces, watching his mother rule as the Dragon Throne's sole occupant, wielding authority with unmatched cunning. It wasn't until Wu Zetian's own fall in 705 CE that Zhongzong returned to power. By then, he was older, perhaps wiser, but certainly more cautious. He reclaimed the throne as a man aware that survival in Chang'an required careful balancing appeasing court factions, keeping the army loyal, and managing a palace full of relatives who each believed they had a better claim to the dragon robe. Among those relatives was his wife, Empress Wei. Beautiful, intelligent, and politically adept, she was more than the ceremonial partner of the Son of Heaven. Wei had ambitions that echoed those of Wu Zetian herself. The precedent was there. If one woman could rise from consort to emperor, why not another? At first, her influence over Zhongzong seemed merely a matter of affection. She persuaded him to promote her relatives, to grant titles and privileges to her allies. Ministers who opposed her found themselves reassigned or dismissed. Soon, a court faction loyal to Wei rivaled any other in the empire. Zhongzong himself had a weakness for indulgence. He was fond of the comforts of palace life banquets, poetry, and the company of his favorites. This made him susceptible to flattery and less inclined to confront the slow consolidation of power happening right under his nose. By 710 CE, whispers circulated through Chang'an that Empress Wei was no longer content to rule from behind the curtain. She wanted the throne for herself, or failing that, for her daughter, Princess Anli. The opportunity came in the summer of that year. The details, as always in palace intrigue, are hazy, but the consensus among later chroniclers is that Zhongzong was poisoned. The method was elegant in its simplicity. A cup of tea or a cake, laced with a toxin known only to a few trusted hands in the inner court. One story has it that Empress Wei herself served the tea, perhaps during a private meal, her expression serene, her voice soft, with the familiarities of long marriage. Zhongzong drank without suspicion. Not long after, he began to feel unwell, dizzy, nauseated, his strength ebbing rapidly. The imperial physicians were summoned, but either they could not help or they did not dare to try. Within hours, the emperor was dead. The official cause was recorded as illness, but few in Chang'an believed it. The speed of the transition was telling. Empress Wei moved swiftly to place her teenage son Li Chongmao on the throne, acting as regent in his name. She hoped to cement her control, perhaps even to emulate Wu Zetian's leap from regent to emperor. But ambition has a way of breeding counterplots. Within weeks, another faction struck this, one led by Princess Taiping, Zhongzong's sister, and Li Longji, his nephew. They stormed the palace, killed Empress Wei, and purged her allies. Her body was thrown into the streets, stripped of imperial dignity, a warning to any who might follow her example. The irony is stark. Empress Wei had almost succeeded in becoming China's second female emperor, but her path to power began with the same act that ended it poisoning the man who had trusted her most. Her story mirrors that of Wu Zetian in ambition, but not in execution. Wu had taken power through years of calculated moves. Wei's gamble was quicker, riskier, and ultimately fatal. For Zhongzong, his second reign was longer than his first, but it ended just as abruptly, bookended by the will of powerful women. His death is remembered less for the policies of his time than for the manner of its coming, a reminder that in the Tang court, the emperor's table could be set for celebration one moment and assassination the next. The tale also underscores a pattern in imperial history. The closer a ruler allowed someone to stand, the sharper the knife they risked feeling between their ribs, or, in Zhongzong's case, the subtler the powder dissolved in their tea. And the Tang court was not done with this kind of quiet killing. Less than 2 decades later, another emperor of the same dynasty would die under suspiciously similar circumstances, not on the battlefield or in the middle of a public coup, but in the still, velvet darkness of the palace night, his life taken in his sleep with the cooperation of the woman who should have been his protector. The poison would be different, the method slightly altered, but the intimacy of the betrayal would remain the same. Emperor Jingzong of Tang. By the year 827 CE, the Tang dynasty was no longer the untouchable colossus it had been during its golden age. The capital, Chang'an, still glittered with imperial splendor, but beneath the lacquered wood and silk curtains, the empire's machinery groaned with corruption, factional rivalries, and whispered plots. Into this atmosphere of gilded decay came Emperor Jingzong, a ruler, young, impulsive, and dangerously unaware of how thin the ice beneath him really was. Born Li Zhan, Jingzong had ascended the throne in 824 CE at the age of 17. His father, Emperor Muzong, had died suddenly, possibly poisoned, and the court was quick to declare the boy emperor. His youth and inexperience meant that much of the empire's real governance fell to senior ministers, eunuchs, and palace women. Jingzong himself preferred the pleasures of imperial life to the grinding work of rule, hunting, feasting, and surrounding himself with entertainers who flattered him endlessly. He was known for extravagance that made older officials wince. Gold and jade trinkets, wild hunting parties in the imperial gardens, midnight banquets where music played until dawn. These were the rhythms of Jingzong's court. His indulgence was more than harmless youth. It was political vulnerability. Every time he ignored the business of state in favor of sport, another hand reached for the levers of power behind the scenes. Among those hands were the eunuchs of the palace guard. In the Tang dynasty, eunuchs were far more than attendants. They were kingmakers and king-breakers, controlling access to the emperor and the flow of information within the palace. Once a eunuch decided an emperor was a liability, it was often only a matter of time before the decision became permanent. Jingzong's private life gave them ammunition. The emperor had a number of favored consorts, but one in particular seems to have played a key role in his fate. Her name is lost to history, but her position beside the young ruler made her a magnet for envy and resentment. She was not just a passive figure in the court's games. She had her own alliances, her own grievances, and, most dangerously, her own ambitions. The plot to kill Jingzong took shape quietly, as all successful palace conspiracies did. A group of eunuchs, already frustrated with the emperor's disregard for governance, found willing cooperation from the empress's quarters. Whether the consort acted out of personal resentment, fear for her own survival, or cold political calculation is unclear. But her cooperation meant the conspirators could strike when Jingzong was at his most vulnerable, alone, asleep, and unguarded. It happened in the dead of night, sometime in late the 8th of January 27. Jingzong had retired after a day of hunting and revelry, exhausted and likely drunk. The palace was quiet, the lamps in the imperial bedchamber dimmed. That was when the assassins came. The eunuchs slipped into the chamber, their soft slippers making no sound on the polished floors. One carried a length of silk cord, the kind used in ceremonial dress. Another carried a dagger. The favored consort was there too. Whether she had personally unlocked the doors or merely stood aside is unknown. What is known is that there was no struggle loud enough to alert the guards. The attack was swift and deliberate. A cord around the neck to cut off breath, a hand clamped over the mouth, the weight of bodies pressing him down. Some accounts suggest the emperor was stabbed, others that strangulation alone did the job. Either way, the young son of heaven was dead before the dawn. His reign had lasted just under 3 years. When news broke, the court erupted into a familiar pattern: shock, condemnation, and then a rush to fill the vacuum. The eunuchs installed Emperor Wenzong, Jingzong's younger brother, on the throne almost immediately. Official records described the death in vague terms. Sudden illness was the euphemism of choice, but the speed of succession and the quiet disappearance of certain figures in the palace told the truth to anyone paying attention. As for the consort, who had allegedly cooperated with the eunuchs, her fate is murky. In most such cases, a collaborator might be rewarded for loyalty to the new order or silenced to prevent inconvenient revelations. Given the Tang court's preference for tying up loose ends, it is possible she never saw the outside of the palace again. Jingzong's assassination was more than the end of one ruler. It was a warning written in blood about the fragility of the imperial position. Even in the heart of the forbidden precincts, behind walls and gates guarded by thousands, the emperor's life depended on the loyalty of a few individuals who stood closest to him. If those individuals decided his reign was over, there was little he could do to stop them. His story also deepened a pattern in Tang history: the use of the emperor's private quarters as the perfect killing ground. Here, no armies clashed, no mobs stormed the gates. Here, death came softly, wrapped in silk and delivered by hands the emperor had once trusted. Jingzong had no great military failures, no catastrophic policy blunders in his short reign. His undoing was personal, a combination of youthful arrogance, misplaced trust, and the quiet ambitions of those around him. He never realized that the same chamber where he entertained his lovers and confidants could become the place of his execution. And just as his own father may have been poisoned, Jingzong's death would foreshadow another in the Tang line, a ruler who, like him, would indulge in pleasures, rely on the wrong people, and discover too late that the most dangerous poison in the empire was the kind slipped into a cup by the women closest to the throne. Emperor Muzong of Tang. By the time Emperor Muzong of Tang took the throne in 820 CE, the dynasty was no longer riding the unshakable momentum of its golden age. The glories of Xuanzong's early reign and the sprawling cultural dominance of the Tang still lingered, but cracks had been widening for decades. Military governors, the Jidushi, had become semi-independent warlords. Eunuchs dominated palace politics, and the central court was increasingly fragile, like a grand lacquered screen with termites gnawing it hollow from the inside. Into this precarious frame stepped Muzong, a man more suited to the indulgences of imperial life than to the ruthless maintenance of empire. Muzong, born Li Heng, was the eldest son of Emperor Xianzong. His father had been a forceful ruler who attempted to rein in the power of the Jidushi, but those efforts had left him with dangerous enemies. In 820 CE, Xianzong died suddenly, officially, of illness, though rumors swirled that poison had been involved. Within days, Muzong was on the throne, crowned as the new son of heaven at the age of 32. From the outset, It was clear that Muzong's priorities were not those of a reformer or a military strategist. He was a man who enjoyed the pleasures of the court. Lavish banquets, elaborate hunts, the company of dancers and musicians. The inner palace became his world, and the matters of state, often urgent and perilous, were delegated to ministers and eunuchs. For a dynasty already under strain, the absence of an engaged, decisive ruler was a dangerous luxury. His reign began with an attempt to project stability. Muzong continued some of his father's policies, at least in name, and presided over ceremonies meant to assure the empire that the mandate of heaven was secure in his hands. But within months, his attention shifted more decisively toward personal enjoyment. The treasury's wealth flowed into entertainments and imperial indulgences, while the affairs of state tax disputes, military campaigns, negotiations with fractious governors were left to fester. In the women's quarters, Muzong's fondness for his consorts was legendary. Several held considerable influence, particularly in appointments to lower offices and court rituals. The Tang court had long been a place where imperial consorts could maneuver for power, but Muzong's inattentiveness to politics allowed these women greater freedom to push their own agendas. Rivalries flared, alliances shifted, and the factions within the palace became as dangerous as any battlefield. The fatal blow to Muzong's reign came not from rebellion or foreign invasion, but from within these silken chambers. In 824 CE, only 4 years after his accession, the emperor fell suddenly and violently ill. Accounts differ on the exact circumstances, but the pattern was suspiciously familiar. A meal or drink taken in the company of favored consorts, a swift onset of symptoms, and a rapid decline that baffled the imperial physicians. Some chroniclers claimed that the emperor had simply overindulged, perhaps a drunken fall or a sudden attack brought on by years of excess. But others whispered of poison, administered by one or more of his own consorts. Theories about motive varied. One suggested that Muzong's affections had shifted away from a particular woman, and that jealousy had transformed into vengeance. Another pointed to the possibility of a political hand guiding the act, using the consorts as tools to remove a complacent ruler and replace him with someone more pliable. What makes Muzong's death especially suspect is the swiftness of the transition. Before his body was cold, his son Li Zhan was declared the new emperor. He would be known as Emperor Jingzong, and, as fate would have it, would meet a similarly intimate and violent end just 3 years later. The ease of succession suggests that key figures in the palace were prepared for Muzong's departure, as though they had been waiting for it. If it was indeed poison that killed him, the choice of method was consistent with Tang palace politics. Poison was the weapon of the inner court, a tool that required access and subtlety. In the emperor's private apartments, there were no guards to stop a consort from pouring wine, no witnesses to question the origin of a dish. The most lethal hands were often the ones that had recently caressed his face. In death, Muzong left behind little in the way of political achievement. His reign is remembered, when remembered at all, as a period of drift years, when the empire's central authority loosened further and its military and provincial governors gained more independence. The treasury was lighter, the palace more divided, and the empire more fragile than when he had inherited it. Yet his end became part of a larger grim tradition in Tang history. Emperors undone not by armies or mobs, but by the quiet, precise treachery of those who shared their bed. Muzong's failure was not just in governance. It was in failing to recognize that, in the palace, love and loyalty could be indistinguishable from ambition, until the poison was already in the cup, and his death would serve as the prelude to the short, ill-fated reign of his son, Emperor Jingzong, another young ruler who would trust too easily, indulge too freely, and find that the people closest to him were the ones most willing to help him into the grave. But beyond even them, the Tang would see still more emperors fall this same way, including one whose own mother would decide that blinding her son to seize the throne was not too steep a price for power. Emperor Constantine VI. The Byzantine Empire in the late 8th century was a place where the throne was as dangerous as it was glittering. On the outside, Constantinople was the shining capital of Christendom, its great walls unbreached, its domes flashing gold in the Mediterranean Sunday. Inside, the palace was a snake pit of intrigue, where family ties were as much a liability as a shield. Few emperors understood that lesson more bitterly than Constantine VI. Constantine was born into a dynasty already steeped in palace drama. His father, Emperor Leo IV, died when Constantine was only 9 years old. That left the boy emperor on the throne, but in reality, the empire was ruled by his mother, Irene of Athens, one of the most formidable women in Byzantine history. She was his regent, his protector, and, increasingly, his competitor for power. Irene was a master of court politics. She cultivated alliances with eunuchs, generals, and church officials, weaving a network of influence so thick that Constantine's title was often an empty formality. When he came of age in 790, Constantine tried to assert his independence. The attempt was bold but clumsy. He dismissed some of Irene's allies and tried to take control of the military. This did not go smoothly. His leadership faltered, and Irene regained control within 2 years, reinstating herself as co-ruler. The empire now had 2 crowned heads, but only one real mind at the helm. Their co-reign was a study in tension. Constantine resented his mother's dominance, and Irene clearly considered her son too inexperienced and perhaps too soft to rule alone. Publicly, they appeared together on coins and decrees, but in private, each was maneuvering to sideline the other. Meanwhile, Constantine's personal life was becoming a political problem. His first marriage, arranged for political advantage, ended in scandal. He divorced his wife to marry his mistress, Theodote, a union that outraged the church and alienated some of his supporters. Irene, a skilled manipulator of public sentiment, capitalized on this outrage to paint her son as immoral and unfit to rule. By 797 CE, the tension reached its breaking point. Irene decided that a shared throne was no longer tolerable and that removing her son entirely was the only way to secure her own power. But in the Byzantine court, a mother could not simply order her son's execution without risking divine and political backlash. The solution was an old imperial tradition: blinding. Blinding a rival was a way to remove them from power without killing them outright. In Byzantine political culture, a physically mutilated man could not serve as emperor. It was both a punishment and a political death sentence. And so, Irene's plot began to take shape, with the quiet cooperation of palace officials who had long been in her debt. Constantine, perhaps sensing the danger, tried to rally loyalists, but Irene's control over the capital made any escape unlikely. One day in the 7th of August 97, he was seized by soldiers loyal to his mother and dragged to the Porphyra chamber in the Great Palace, the same room where he had been born, bathed in imperial purple. The irony was as cruel as it was calculated. There, in the room of his birth, Constantine was blinded. The exact method is lost to history, some say with heated metal rods, others with knives, but the result was the same. The young emperor, only in his mid-20s, was left permanently sightless. The trauma of the blinding was so severe that he is believed to have died soon afterward, though official records politely omit the cause. With Constantine gone, Irene became the sole ruler of the Byzantine Empire, taking the unprecedented title of Basileus Emperor, not Empress of the Romans. For 5 years, she reigned in her own right, defying convention and cementing her place in history as the first and only woman to rule Byzantium as emperor. But her triumph was shadowed by the manner in which she had seized power. Even in an age when fratricide and political mutilation were grimly routine, the blinding of her own son was shocking. Some contemporaries saw it as a monstrous betrayal, others as the inevitable outcome of a bitter power struggle. The Church, which had supported Irene in her earlier regency, grew uneasy with the blood on her hands though, notably not uneasy enough to depose her immediately. For Constantine VI, history has been less kind. His reign is remembered largely through the lens of his mother's ambition and ruthlessness. Yet his short, troubled time on the throne fits neatly into the recurring theme of imperial vulnerability. The gravest threats often came from the people an emperor should have been able to trust the most. The lesson was not lost on later rulers, who kept mothers, wives, and even sons under tight control whenever possible. But in the Byzantine world, blood ties and palace walls did not guarantee safety. The very intimacy of family made betrayal easier and often more devastating than the blows of any foreign enemy. And the dynasty's next act of deadly intimacy would prove this again. Not long after Irene's reign ended, another emperor would be brought down in a plot that wove together the threads of love, jealousy, and ambition, involving a mistress whose influence at court could topple an emperor as surely as any army at the gates. The blade in that story would not blind, it would kill outright, in the most decisive way possible. Emperor Michael III. By the mid-9th century, the Byzantine Empire had clawed its way out of the iconoclast controversy and was entering what historians now call the Macedonian Renaissance, a period of military resurgence and cultural revival. But inside the imperial palace in Constantinople, the air was still thick with the scent of intrigue, and the corridors still echoed with the quiet footsteps of those who were plotting to remove the man on the throne. That man was Emperor Michael III, later remembered somewhat unfairly as Michael the Drunkard. Michael had ascended to the throne in 842 CE as a child of just 3 years old after the death of his father, Theophilos. His mother, Theodora, served as regent, and for a while, the empire's affairs were in steady hands. She ended the long and bitter conflict over icon veneration by restoring the use of religious images, an act that stabilized the church and won her popularity. But Theodora's regency could not last forever. When Michael came of age, he removed his mother from the regency and confined her to a monastery, a gesture that set the tone for his later reign. The young emperor proved more interested in revelry than in administration. He was known for his love of horse racing, lavish banquets, and long nights of drinking with his favorites. It was a dangerous combination, a ruler with ultimate authority, but little inclination to use it wisely. One of the most important figures in Michael's life was his mistress, Eudokia, in Gerina. She was not merely a consort, she was central to the web of personal and political relationships that defined the court. The problem was that Michael already had a legitimate wife, Empress Eudokia Decapolitissa, chosen for him by his mother. Michael openly favored Angerina over his lawful wife, which caused endless tension at court and gave his enemies plenty of material to work with. Among those enemies, or perhaps frenemies, was Basil the Macedonian, a man who rose from humble origins to become one of Michael's closest companions. Basil's rise was meteoric. He began as a stable hand, caught Michael's attention with his skill in taming horses, and quickly became a trusted bodyguard, then co-emperor. His promotion was as shocking as it was strategic. Michael needed someone loyal to him personally, unentangled in the entrenched aristocratic factions. But the personal and political soon blurred. To preserve his relationship with Ingerina without causing a scandal, Michael arranged for her to marry Basil. This bizarre solution allowed Michael to continue his affair while keeping Ingerina respectably Wednesday. Some historians even speculate that Basil's children by Ingerina, most notably Leo VI, were actually fathered by Michael. Whether or not this is true, it's a measure of how tangled and precarious the relationships in the palace had become. Over time, Basil's position strengthened. He proved himself capable in administration and on the battlefield, qualities that Michael lacked. As Basil's power grew, so did the suspicion between the two men. Michael's heavy drinking and erratic decisions began to grate on his ministers, and Basil, once his loyal subordinate, started to imagine a future in which he alone held the purple. The turning point came when Michael began to favor another courtier, a man named Basiliskianos, and spoke openly about deposing Basil. In the Byzantine court, such talk was rarely idle. Basil, understanding that his life and career were now at risk, decided to act before Michael could move against him. The plot was swift and brutal. On the night of the 23rd of September, 867, Michael attended a banquet in the street Mama's palace, drinking heavily as usual. When he retired to his chamber, he was in no condition to defend himself. Basil and his co-conspirators entered quietly, catching the emperor in his sleep. They drew their swords and cut him down where he lay. Michael's death was not drawn out. There were no ceremonial trials or symbolic mutilations. It was the straightforward solution of men who knew that hesitation could be fatal. By dawn, Basil had secured the palace, declared himself sole emperor, and begun the first chapter of what would be remembered as the Macedonian dynasty. Eudokia Ingerina's role in the affair remains one of the great questions of Byzantine gossip. Some suggest she sided with Basil to protect her own position, recognizing that Michael's days were numbered. Others imagine her as a pawn caught between two ambitious men, powerless to stop the tide once it turned. Whatever her feelings, the reality was that the man she had shared her life with was dead, and the man who killed him was now her husband and her emperor. Michael III's reign is remembered in a way that obscures his political realities. The nickname the Drunkard comes from hostile chroniclers writing under Basil's rule, eager to justify the assassination by portraying Michael as incompetent. In truth, while he was certainly prone to excess, his reign had seen military successes and the early stages of a cultural revival. But those achievements were overshadowed by the circumstances of his death and the murky love triangle that framed it. In the end, Michael's greatest mistake was not his drinking or even his favoritism toward Ingerina. It was his failure to understand that in the Byzantine palace, the man closest to you physically was often the man most capable of killing you. Basil had been raised to power by Michael's own hand, yet in the end, it was that hand Basil struck down to seize the scepter. And the pattern would repeat itself. Just over 3 centuries later, another Byzantine emperor would find himself undone by a combination of personal scandal, court betrayal, and the rage of a populace that had once cheered him. His death would be far more public than Michael's torturous, humiliating, and set against the backdrop of a mob's vengeance. If Michael's murder was a private affair, this next emperor's end would be a spectacle. Emperor Andronikos I Komnenos. In the summer of 1185 CE, the Byzantine Empire was a boiling cauldron of resentment. The man on the throne, Emperor Andronikos I Komnenos, had once been hailed as a reformer, a charismatic rogue who had ridden into the capital like a savior. But by the end of his reign, his name was whispered with hatred in the marketplaces of Constantinople. Andronikos was about to discover that in Byzantium, the people who once cheered your arrival could just as easily cheer your destruction. Andronikos's path to the throne had been anything but ordinary. Born into the powerful Komnenos dynasty, he was a cousin to Emperor Manuel I and spent much of his early life in exile, partly for political reasons, partly for his own reckless behavior. He was a man of remarkable charm and scandalous appetites, notorious for seducing noblewomen, even the wives and daughters of his hosts. His skill with a sword and his sharp political instincts made him dangerous in both the battlefield and the bedroom. When Manuel I died in 1180, the empire was left to his young son, Alexios II, under the regency of his mother, Empress Maria of Antioch. Maria's Western origins made her unpopular with the Greek populace, and her court was seen as corrupt and wasteful. Andronikos, sensing opportunity, returned from exile with a populist message. He would sweep away corruption, defend the empire, and restore justice. At first, he was true to his word. Upon seizing control, he launched a purge of the aristocracy, stripping the wealthy of their ill-gotten gains and redistributing lands. Ordinary citizens cheered him as a man who stood against the excesses of the court. But the purges quickly grew bloodier. Nobles were tortured and executed on flimsy charges. Rivals vanished into dungeons or were hurled into the Bosporus. The same charisma that had once won hearts became a weapon of fear. Andronikos also took a shocking step that cemented his reputation as both scandalous and ruthless. He married the teenage widow of Manuel Alexios II's own wife, Agnes of France. This was not only a political maneuver to consolidate his claim to the throne, but also a personal act that scandalized the empire. Agnes was barely in her teens, Andronikos was in his 60s. The marriage was an unmistakable statement. He would bind the imperial family to himself, whatever the moral cost. In 1183, Andronikos formally seized the throne, deposing young Alexios II. The boy was strangled almost certainly on Andronikos's orders, and his body was discarded without ceremony. With no rivals left in the imperial family, Andronikos seemed secure. But his rule grew increasingly tyrannical. His paranoia deepened, and the purges continued. Any hint of dissent was met with brutal reprisals. The breaking point came in 1185. News arrived that a massive Norman army from Sicily had landed in Greece, capturing Thessaloniki with appalling violence. Instead of rallying his forces, Andronikos hesitated, possibly fearing that the generals he sent might use the crisis to replace him. The people of Constantinople saw this as cowardice, or worse, treachery. Amid the panic, a coup began to form. The leader was Isaac Angelos, a nobleman who had recently killed one of Andronikos's officers sent to arrest him. The people rallied to Isaac, and the streets of Constantinople erupted in open revolt. For days, mobs surged through the city, hunting down Andronikos's officials and allies. Andronikos, realizing his position was collapsing, attempted to flee. Disguised as a commoner, he boarded a small boat on the Bosporus. But fate, or perhaps divine irony, was against him. A storm forced him back to shore, where he was captured by Isaac's supporters. What followed was one of the most infamous executions in Byzantine history. The mob dragged Andronikos through the streets, beating him with clubs and fists. His hair and beard were torn out by the roots. He was paraded before the jeering crowds, his regal robes shredded. Some accounts say his teeth were knocked out. Others describe his nose being cut off. Finally, he was tied to a post in the Hippodrome, the same arena where emperors once staged chariot races for the people's amusement. The crowd took turns tormenting him, blinding him in one eye, breaking his ribs, stabbing him with swords. His young wife Agnes reportedly watched from a distance, powerless to intervene. It took hours for Andronikos to die. When he finally succumbed, his body was unrecognizable, a ruin of the man who had once ruled an empire. Andronikos's rise and fall are a brutal reminder of how quickly fortune could turn in Byzantium. He had come to power as a champion of the people and died at their hands in one of the most public, humiliating deaths an emperor could suffer. His downfall was not the result of a single enemy's plot, but of a city's collective rage fueled by betrayal, cruelty, and a sense that the man they had trusted had become something monstrous. The irony is that the seeds of his death were sown by the same qualities that had elevated him: charm, boldness, and a willingness to defy convention. Those traits had made him a hero to the crowds in 1182, and a villain to them just 3 years later. But, in the grand chronicle of rulers undone by those closest to them, Andronikos's fate stands out for its sheer spectacle. If earlier emperors in our tale had been quietly poisoned in their chambers or strangled in their sleep, his end was the opposite, drawn out, bloody, and witnessed by thousands. And yet, even after such a public fall, the cycle of betrayal would continue. Far to the west, across the centuries, another monarch would rise in splendor, only to be undone by a wife who turned her back on him. He would not die in the streets, but in the shadows of a cold prison cell, his end whispered as much in rumour as in official decree. His name was Edward II of England, and his story would prove that royal murder could be just as intimate and just as brutal without the roar of a Byzantine mob. King Edward II of England. The reign of Edward II began with pageantry and promise. In July 1307, the young king inherited the throne after the death of his father, Edward I, known as Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots. Edward I had been a formidable monarch, a warrior king whose very presence on the battlefield inspired fear. His son, however, was cut from different cloth. Where Edward I had been relentless and disciplined, Edward II was indulgent, erratic, and fatally loyal to favourites who drew the hatred of England's nobility. From the beginning, Edward II's court was dominated by one man, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston had been a companion of the young prince for years, sharing in tournaments, hunting parties, and private amusements that sparked persistent rumours about the nature of their relationship. When Edward ascended the throne, he elevated Gaveston to the highest honours, showering him with titles and wealth. The English barons were outraged not merely because of Gaveston's rapid rise, but because Edward seemed to prefer his company to theirs in matters of both state and leisure. The barons forced Gaveston's exile more than once, but Edward always found a way to bring him back. This dangerous devotion finally ended in 1312, when Gaveston was captured by the king's enemies and executed. Edward's grief was deep and public, but instead of learning caution, he repeated the same mistake with a new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston had been a source of irritation, Despenser was a full-blown provocation. He was ruthless, ambitious, and greedy, using his closeness to the king to seize lands and wealth at the expense of other nobles. The resentment toward Despenser was so intense that it sparked a full-scale rebellion. Among those leading the opposition was Roger Mortimer, a powerful marcher lord with a personal grudge against the Despenser family. The rebellion failed, and Mortimer was imprisoned in the Tower of London. But in 1323, he escaped an audacious feat involving drugged guards and a climb down the fortress walls. He fled to France, where he would become the most dangerous man in Edward's life. It was in France that Mortimer encountered Queen Isabella, Edward's wife. Isabella had been married to Edward since she was a young teenager, a union meant to secure peace between England and France. At first, she played her role dutifully, even enduring the humiliation of her husband's blatant favoritism toward Gaveston and later Despenser. But by the mid-1322, the Queen's patience had eroded into loathing. Edward had confiscated her lands, reduced her household, and treated her as little more than a political pawn. In France, far from his reach, Isabella found in Mortimer not only an ally but a lover. Together, they began plotting to overthrow the king. Their alliance was as much about personal vengeance as it was about politics. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small force. The invasion was less a grand military campaign than a swift and decisive political strike. Nobles and commoners alike rallied to their banner, tired of Edward's misrule and Despenser's tyranny. The king fled westward, but he was soon captured along with Hugh Despenser. Despenser's end was spectacularly brutal. He was publicly hanged, drawn, and quartered. Edward, however, was spared such a public fate. In January 1327, Parliament declared him deposed the first English king, forced to abdicate by formal process. His 14-year-old son was crowned as Edward III, with Isabella and Mortimer ruling as regents. But a deposed king was still a threat. As long as Edward II lived, there was the possibility of loyalists rallying to restore him. And so, in September 1327, Edward was moved to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, under the guard of men loyal to Mortimer. What happened next is one of the most enduring and grim mysteries in English history. The official record claims Edward died of natural causes, quietly and without violence. But almost immediately, rumours spread of murder. Murder ordered by Mortimer and perhaps Isabella herself. The most lurid of these stories insists that Edward was killed in a manner designed to leave no visible marks. A red-hot poker thrust into his body through the rectum, the heat destroying his internal organs while avoiding outward wounds. The gruesome method was said to be chosen both for secrecy and as a symbolic punishment for his alleged sexual relationships with his male favourites. Whether the tale is true or not, it captured the imagination of chroniclers and ensured Edward's death would be remembered as one of the most shocking in English history. Some later accounts suggest he may have escaped and lived in obscurity, but the political reality of the time makes such survival unlikely. The important fact is that his reign ended not with a battle, but with betrayal by the very woman who had once stood beside him at the altar. Isabella and Mortimer enjoyed their power for a few short years, but in 1330, the now teenage Edward III staged a coup against them. Mortimer was executed for treason and Isabella was placed under comfortable house arrest. Her fall mirrored her husband's in one key way. The person she had trusted most had turned against her when the moment was right. Edward II's story is a study in the dangers of personal favoritism in monarchy. His inability to manage his relationships with powerful nobles, combined with his blindness to the growing hostility of his wife, led directly to his downfall. In the medieval world, a king could survive rebellion, famine, even military defeat, but he could not survive a spouse who allied with his enemies. And this was hardly a phenomenon limited to England. Centuries later, in a far colder and more autocratic court, a similar pattern would play out in Russia. There, Another monarch would discover that his crown offered no protection from a wife who had decided she could rule better herself. That man was Peter III, and his end would come not with whispers and secret chambers, but with the decisive stroke of a coup that left his body cooling in a cell, while his wife ascended the throne as one of history's most formidable rulers, Peter III of Russia. In the icy corridors of 18th century Russian politics, trust was a currency no monarch could afford to spend lightly. Peter III, the short-lived emperor of Russia, learned this too late. His reign lasted a mere 6 months in 1762, a brief, chaotic interlude between the long, austere rule of Empress Elizabeth and the towering dominance of Catherine the Great. If Edward II's downfall in England had been a slow burn of marital alienation and political disaster, Peter's was a lightning strike, sudden, decisive, and orchestrated by the very woman who would replace him on the throne. Peter was born Karl Peter Ulrich of Holstein-Gottorp, a German prince and the grandson of Peter the Great. He was plucked from the courts of northern Germany at the age of 14 and brought to Russia as the heir presumptive to his aunt, Empress Elizabeth. His upbringing was shaped as much by the stiff German militarism of his youth as by the glittering but treacherous etiquette of the Russian court. Unfortunately, neither environment seemed to have prepared him to win the hearts or even the cautious respect of his new subjects. Physically awkward, socially tone-deaf, and politically naive, Peter alienated much of the Russian nobility almost immediately upon his accession in January 1762. His policies, many of which seemed to favor Prussia over Russia, baffled and angered the court. He admired Frederick the Great, Russia's recent enemy, and within weeks of becoming emperor, he withdrew Russian forces from the 7 Years' War, effectively handing Frederick a victory. To Russia's military elite, this was not diplomacy, it was betrayal. While Peter stumbled through his early months as ruler, Catherine, his wife of 17 years, was already moving in a different direction. Born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess, Catherine had long since transformed herself into a Russian in language, religion, and political ambition. She was intelligent, charismatic, and far more attuned to the rhythms of Russian power than her husband. Their marriage had never been one of love. Peter's infidelities were public, and Catherine had her own affairs. But where Peter was careless, Catherine was calculating. By the spring of 1762, Peter's unpopularity was an open secret. His reforms, such as secularizing church lands and attempting to modernize the army in imitation of the Prussians, alienated the clergy and the military alike. Worse still, he had surrounded himself with a clique of foreign advisors, reinforcing the image of him as an outsider, ruling in Russia's name, but not in its interest. Catherine saw the danger, but also the opportunity. She began to build alliances quietly, cultivating relationships with key military officers, particularly within the elite Imperial Guard regiments stationed in St. Petersburg. Among her most important allies was Grigory Orlov, her lover and a respected officer. The Orlov brothers, a formidable political and military clan, became the muscle behind her plan. The coup unfolded with breathtaking speed. On the morning of the 9th of July, 1762, Catherine left her residence under the pretext of visiting the Izmailovsky regiment. There, dressed in the uniform of a guards officer, she was proclaimed the sole ruler of Russia. The guards swore loyalty to her, and within hours she had secured the allegiance of other regiments, the Senate, and the Holy Synod. The streets of St. Petersburg filled with soldiers chanting her name. Peter, at that moment, was at his estate of Oranienbaum unaware of how quickly the tide had turned. When news of the uprising reached him, he attempted to muster resistance, but his support evaporated almost instantly. The same guards who had sworn loyalty to him days before now marched under Catherine's banner. Realizing he had no army left to command, Peter fled to the coastal town of Kronstadt, hoping to escape by sea. There, however, the fortress commander refused him entry, declaring loyalty to Catherine. Faced with the inevitable, Peter returned to Oranienbaum and signed a formal act of abdication. His words were humble, almost pitiful, acknowledging Catherine as the rightful ruler and renouncing all claims to the throne. It was an act meant to save his life, but in the volatile calculus of palace politics, an ex-emperor was too dangerous to keep alive. Catherine had Peter taken to Ropsha, a small estate outside St. Petersburg, under guard by officers loyal to the Orlovs. Less than a week later, on the 17th of July, word reached the capital. Peter was dead. The official explanation was apoplexy, a sudden stroke, but few believed it. Most historians agree that he was murdered, likely strangled during a drunken brawl staged to look like an accident. Grigory Orlov and his brothers were almost certainly involved, whether on their own initiative or with Catherine's tacit approval. Catherine herself would later insist that she had not ordered the killing, but her lack of outrage and her rapid consolidation of power afterward spoke volumes. Peter's reign, short as it was, left a mark in its abruptness and its lessons about imperial vulnerability. In less than 200 days, he had gone from emperor of one of the world's largest empires to a corpse in a provincial estate, undone entirely by domestic betrayal. He had not been defeated in battle or deposed by foreign invasion. He had been overthrown in the capital itself by the elite soldiers who were supposed to be his bodyguard and by the wife whose crown he had shared. Catherine's coup became one of the most successful and decisive in Russian history. She would go on to rule for more than 3 decades, earning the title the Great through expansionist wars, internal reforms, and the cultivation of Enlightenment ideals. Her reign would overshadow Peter's so completely that his name became a footnote, a brief, clumsy interlude between 2 long and stable governments. Yet the story of Peter III's fall is essential to understanding the fragility of autocracy. Absolute power may appear unassailable, but in practice it rests on the continued loyalty of a few key figures. When those figures turn, whether from ideology, ambition, or personal grievance, the transformation from ruler to prisoner can happen in a single day. And as Russia's imperial story would prove, even the most formidable monarch could meet the same fate. Less than half a century after Peter's death, another emperor would be brought down by palace conspirators, with his wife's knowledge casting a long shadow over the crime. Unlike Peter, this ruler had ruled for years, not months, but in the end, his strangled body would be a reminder that in the gilded courts of empire, the embrace of a spouse could be just as fatal as the blade of an enemy. That emperor was Paul I of Russia, and his final night was a lesson in how swiftly a palace could turn from sanctuary to tomb. Emperor Paul I of Russia. The night of the 23rd of March, 1801, began like any other in the sprawling Mikhailovsky Castle in Street. Petersburg, a fortress palace Paul I had built to keep himself safe from the conspiracies he was certain lurked in every shadow. High walls, a surrounding moat, secret passages. The architecture itself was a testament to the emperor's paranoia. And yet, as the clock struck midnight, the very fears that had driven Paul to isolate himself would come crashing down, not from foreign assassins or shadowy revolutionaries, but from his own inner circle. Paul's path to the throne had been a long and bitter one. Born in 1754, he was the son of Peter III and Catherine the Great. Though his paternity was whispered about, even in his youth many believed Catherine's lover, Sergei Saltykov, was his true father. Regardless of his parentage, Paul was sidelined from real power during his mother's 34-year reign. Catherine treated him as a potential rival rather than a successor, keeping him away from court politics and grooming his son, Alexander, with suspicious favoritism. When Catherine died in 1796, Paul finally ascended the throne at the age of 42. His reign began with energy and reform. He sought to clean up corruption, discipline the nobility, and reassert imperial control over the army. But his methods, strict, often impulsive, and at times petty, quickly alienated the very aristocracy and military elite he needed to survive. Paul had a particular talent for making enemies. He reversed some of Catherine's policies out of spite rather than strategy, reinstating old laws and imposing new ones without consultation. His military regulations, modelled after the rigid Prussian system, were deeply unpopular. He dismissed experienced officers, promoted favourites of questionable merit, and micromanaged everything from uniform styles to parade drills. In foreign policy, Paul's sudden shifts alarmed his allies. He broke with Britain and Austria to make peace with Napoleon, then abruptly began preparing for an invasion of British India. These unpredictable swings created the impression that the emperor was unstable, a perception that his enemies would use against him. At home, his paranoia grew. He surrounded himself with guards and informers, convinced that plots were brewing everywhere. Ironically, this very mistrust fostered the conditions for his assassination. The nobles and generals he alienated began to talk quietly among themselves. Soon their whispers solidified into a conspiracy with a singular aim: remove Paul and replace him with his son, Alexander. The ringleaders included some of the most powerful men in Russia: Count Palin, the governor of St. Petersburg, General Bennigsen, a respected officer of Hanoverian origin, and Admiral Panin. Their motives were mixed. Some feared Paul's erratic policies were driving Russia toward ruin. Others simply wanted to restore their own influence at court. Hovering in the background was Empress Maria Feodorovna, Paul's wife. Though there is no definitive proof that she actively planned his death, she was certainly aware of the growing conspiracy. Maria had endured Paul's volatile temper for years, and her position as empress was secure only through her children, especially the popular heir, Alexander. Protecting Alexander, and perhaps herself, may have required turning a blind eye to what was about to happen. On the night of the assassination, the conspirators made their move. They knew Paul was in Mikhailovsky Castle, a building he believed impregnable. But as with so many rulers before him, the greatest danger was already inside the walls. A small group of officers, including Bennigsen and the volatile cavalryman Nikolai Zubov, slipped into the palace after midnight. They made their way to the emperor's private chambers, dispatching the few guards without raising an alarm. Paul was asleep when they entered. Awakened by the noise, he attempted to flee. Hiding behind a screen or inside a small chamber accounts differ. The conspirators confronted him, demanding that he abdicate in favor of Alexander. Paul refused, lashing out in anger. The situation turned violent. Bennigsen reportedly stepped aside, allowing Zubov and others to seize the emperor. In the struggle, Paul was thrown to the floor. A scarf or sash, perhaps even his own, was wrapped around his neck. The officers pressed down, strangling him as he thrashed. Some accounts say Zubov struck him with a heavy gold snuff box before the strangulation, knocking him nearly unconscious. Within minutes, the Emperor of Russia was dead on the carpet of his own bedroom. The conspirators wasted no time. They summoned Alexander, who had been kept in the dark about the exact timing and method of the plot. When told his father was dead, Alexander reportedly turned pale and muttered, "Forgive me." Whether those words were a confession of guilt or a prayer for the soul of the man he now replaced is left to history's speculation. Officially, the court announced that Paul had died of apoplexy, a sudden stroke. Few believed it, but in Russia, truth was often subordinate to the needs of stability. Maria Feodorovna reacted with grief and fury, demanding to see her husband's body and refusing to acknowledge Alexander as emperor for hours. But her resistance was symbolic at best. The succession was already settled. Paul's reign had lasted just over 4 years, but his violent death cemented his place in the long line of monarchs who learned too late that the walls of a palace can be more dangerous than an open battlefield. His obsession with security had driven him to build a fortress palace, yet the assassins had not needed to breach its defenses. They had walked in with keys and titles, smiling as they approached. For the Russian Empire, Paul's murder was both a shock and a precedent. It confirmed that an unpopular Tsar could be removed without a civil war, provided the coup was clean and the heir acceptable. But it also carried a warning. The throne was not a birthright secured by divine will alone. It was a seat held at the pleasure of those who commanded the army and the court. And Russia was hardly the only place where the quiet cooperation or willful blindness of a royal spouse could seal a ruler's fate. Nearly 1,500 years earlier, in the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo, palace intrigue and whispers of poison would claim the life of a monarch named Sansang. His end would come not at the hands of rampaging officers, but in the deceptively gentle gesture of a cup passed across a table. Emperor Sansang of Goguryeo. The ancient Korean kingdom of Goguryeo was a land of high stone fortresses, fierce cavalry, and a court culture as intricate and perilous as any in Rome, Byzantium, or China. By the early 3rd century CE, Goguryeo had already built a reputation as a formidable power, dominating much of Manchuria and the northern Korean peninsula. It was a kingdom forged in warfare and sustained by a rigid hierarchy, in which loyalty was demanded and betrayal punished without mercy. Yet even here, in this warrior society, a king could find himself undone, not by an enemy's blade, but by the quiet treachery of his own household. Sansang, who reigned from 197 to 227 CE, inherited a throne that was both an honor and a burden. The kingdom's borders were constantly tested by rival states, most notably the Chinese warlords, who ruled the fractured remnants of the Han dynasty to the west, and the smaller Korean states of Baekje and Silla to the south. The court itself was no less dangerous, with powerful aristocratic clans wielding influence in both the military and the royal household. From the beginning, Sansang's position was delicate. He was a monarch, expected to command in war and govern with wisdom, but he also had to navigate the intricate balance between royal authority and the vested interests of the great noble families. These clans, often intermarried with the royal line, considered themselves stakeholders in the throne's stability, and sometimes in its occupant. Within the palace walls, Sansang's marriage was as much a political alliance as a personal relationship. His queen, whose name is lost to history, likely came from one of the great aristocratic houses. Her presence in the court would have been more than ceremonial. She would have had her own retinue of attendants, her own network of allies, and her own role in influencing the king's decisions. In such a world, the queen could be a partner in rule, or a rival with ambitions of her own. The records that survive from Goguryeo's early centuries are fragmentary, drawn from later Korean chronicles and Chinese accounts. Yet one story persists, whispered across the centuries, that Sansang's death was no accident of nature, but the result of poison administered by his own queen. The motive is obscured by time, but the possibilities are many. Perhaps it was a personal grievance, jealousy over a rival consort, resentment over perceived slights, or anger at political decisions that weakened her family's position. Perhaps it was a calculated move by a faction within the court, using the queen as the most direct means to remove a monarch whose policies threatened their power. If the killing was indeed political, the choice of poison was a logical one. In a heavily guarded palace, it would be almost impossible to strike down the king openly without causing an uproar. But food and drink passed easily into the royal chambers, often by the hands of those closest to the ruler. A cup of wine, a bowl of rice, a delicacy offered with a smile, these could be as deadly as any assassin's dagger. The moment itself, as we might imagine it, would have been deceptively ordinary. Sansang at table, perhaps in the late afternoon, sharing a quiet meal with his queen, or a small circle of attendants. A toast is made, the cup raised to his lips. The poison would have been tasteless or masked by the drink's flavor. Minutes later, the first symptoms, dizziness, nausea, a creeping weakness, would begin to take hold. The king's attendants might summon physicians, but the remedies of the time were no match for a well-prepared toxin. Whether he realized the truth in his final moments, we cannot know. What is certain is that his death in 227 CE marked the end of a reign that had lasted 3 decades, and that the transition of power was swift. His successor, Dongchon, took the throne with little recorded resistance, suggesting that the succession had been prepared in advance, a fact that strengthens the suspicion of a planned assassination. For the people of Goguryeo, the death of a king was more than a political event. It was a disruption in the cosmic order. The monarch was considered the link between heaven and earth, the guarantor of prosperity and victory in war. When that link was severed by treachery, it left a shadow over the realm. Yet, in the brutal logic of palace politics, the end of one reign was simply the beginning of another. Sansang's fate is a reminder that the dangers faced by kings were not confined to the battlefield. In the most secure palaces of the ancient world, where walls were thick and guards vigilant, the greatest threat could be the person sitting across the table. His death joins the long list of rulers across continents and centuries who learned too late that the bonds of marriage could conceal a noose. And in this respect, Goguryeo story was not unique. In another part of China, just a few centuries later, a ruler of the northern Qi dynasty, Emperor Wenxuan, would face a remarkably similar end. Like Sansang, he was a warrior king whose reign was undone not by enemy armies, but by the hand of a wife who saw more advantage in his death than in his continued rule. The poison in that tale would be brewed in the same intimate, treacherous space, the royal bedchamber. Emperor Wenxuan of northern Qi. In the mid-6th century, northern China was a fractured land, split between rival dynasties born from the ashes of the Northern Wei. The northern Qi, founded by the ambitious and warlike Gao Yang, emerged in 550 CE as a formidable, if unstable, power. Gao Yang would rule as Emperor Wenxuan, the dynasty's founding sovereign, a man of contradictions, brilliant and decisive in war, volatile and cruel in peace. His reign was a storm, and like many storms, it burned itself out in chaos. Gao Yang's path to the throne was forged in blood. The northern Wei had collapsed into eastern and western halves, each controlled by military strongmen. Gao Yang's father, Gao Huan, was one such figure, the de facto ruler of Eastern Wei. When Gao Huan died, Gao Yang inherited his armies and influence. But Gao Yang was not content to remain the power behind a puppet emperor. In 550 CE, he forced Emperor Xiaojing of Eastern Wei to abdicate, placing himself on the throne as Emperor Wenxuan. As a ruler, Wenxuan was capable of decisive military action. He secured the borders, reorganized the administration, and for a time brought stability to a kingdom born from civil war. But alongside these achievements was a darker side, a temper prone to violent rages, an appetite for heavy drinking, and a sadistic streak that made life at court perilous for anyone who crossed him. He was known to execute officials on a whim and to mete out punishments with his own hands. In the midst of this volatile court stood Empress Li, his wife and official consort. The details of her early life are thin, but she was politically astute and well-connected, likely chosen as much for the alliance her marriage cemented as for any personal affection. Navigating the moods of such a dangerous husband would have required extraordinary skill and a constant calculation of whether loyalty was worth the risk. As Wenxuan's reign progressed, his personal behavior deteriorated. The pressures of ruling, his heavy drinking, and his violent temper combined to alienate allies and sow fear among those closest to him. He humiliated and mistreated his officials, alienated members of his own family, and at times seemed to court self-destruction. Empress Li would have witnessed all of this up close, his cruelty, his instability, and perhaps most importantly, the growing number of enemies who might welcome his fall. By 559 CE, the emperor's erratic conduct had created an atmosphere in which his death could be seen not as a catastrophe, but as an opportunity. Whether Empress Li acted alone or as part of a larger faction remains uncertain, but the accusation that she poisoned him has persisted in historical accounts. The method would have been familiar to palace assassins for centuries. A lethal dose slipped into wine or food, administered in the private comfort of the imperial chambers. The act itself may have been almost invisible, a shared meal, a cup offered with practiced grace, the poison masked by the richness of the drink. Wenxuan, accustomed to indulgence, might not have noticed anything amiss until the effects began to take hold. A sudden wave of weakness, a burning in the gut, perhaps the metallic tang of blood rising in his mouth. In those final moments, it's unlikely he would have suspected his wife. After all, the danger he feared most came from generals, ministers, or rival princes, not from the woman who shared his bed. When Wenxuan died, he was only 31 years old, having ruled for just 9 years. His death was officially recorded without scandal, but the speed of the succession was telling. His young son, Gao Yin, ascended the throne as Emperor Fei, with powerful ministers quickly stepping in to guide the new reign. The court did not linger over the circumstances of Wenxuan's passing, another sign that the removal of this volatile ruler had been quietly welcomed by those in power. As for Empress Li, history offers little clarity on her fate. In many such cases, a consort involved in regicide might be rewarded if her actions served the interests of the new regime, or eliminated if her knowledge posed a risk. The silence of the records after Wenxuan's death leaves both possibilities open. What is certain is that her alleged role in his demise entered the annals as one more instance of the intimate assassinations that so often punctuated imperial history. Wenxuan's story fits the pattern of many monarchs undone by their own excesses. His military skill and political instincts were real, but they were undermined by personal instability. His reign might have lasted decades had he tempered his cruelty and distrust. Instead, he created a palace where those closest to him saw more advantage in his death than in his continued rule. The lesson of Wenxuan's end is one repeated across centuries and cultures. Power at the very top is most vulnerable not to open enemies, but to the people within arm's reach. Poison, that most silent of weapons, requires proximity. It demands access to the ruler's table, his cup, his daily life. Few in the empire could get so close, but a wife could do so every day without raising suspicion. And Wenxuan was far from the last ruler in this tradition. Nearly a millennium later, in a very different kingdom, another monarch, Henry VI of England, would meet his end in the shadows of a prison cell after years of political instability. In his case, too, suspicion would fall on his queen, whose shifting alliances and fierce defense of her own cause made her as formidable an operator in palace politics as any empress of old. The knife in that story might not be visible, but the guiding hand would once again belong to a wife, King Henry VI of England. The life of Henry VI was a tragedy in slow motion, the story of a man born to be king who was entirely unsuited for the role. His reign was punctuated by military disasters, political betrayals, and stretches of mental collapse that left him incapable of ruling. By the time he met his end in the Tower of London in May 1471, Henry was less a monarch than a symbol, a pawn passed between factions during the Wars of the Roses, and a reminder that in medieval politics, being too gentle could be just as dangerous as being too cruel. Henry was born in 1421, the only son of the legendary Henry V, the victor of Agincourt. His father's death the following year left the infant Henry as king of both England and France, a claim that, in theory, united two crowns but, in practice, placed him at the center of a political and military storm. Regents ruled in his name until he came of age, but even as a boy, Henry showed little of his father's martial vigor. He was pious, mild-mannered, and uncomfortable with the ruthless pragmatism kingship demanded. By the time Henry took personal control of government in the 1432nd, England's position in France was deteriorating. The 100 Years' War, which had once promised glory, was turning into a costly grind. Losses on the battlefield eroded English prestige, and Henry's inability to inspire his armies or his nobles only worsened the situation. His marriage in 1445 to Margaret of Anjou, a French princess, was intended to secure peace, but it came with concessions that angered the English nobility, including the cession of territory in Maine. Margaret, however, was no passive queen. She was intelligent, fiercely protective of her husband, and politically ambitious. She quickly emerged as the dominant force in Henry's court, filling the void left by his indecisiveness. But her assertiveness alienated many nobles, particularly Richard, Duke of York, who believed he had a stronger claim to the throne than Henry. Henry's mental health collapsed in 1453, possibly triggered by the news of the loss of Bordeaux to the French. For more than a year, he was catatonic, unable to speak or recognize those around him. In this vacuum, the Duke of York was appointed protector of the realm. When Henry recovered in late 1454, Margaret moved swiftly to push York out and secure the succession for her young son, Edward of Westminster. These rivalries erupted into open conflict in 1455, the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. For the next 16 years, England was torn apart by a brutal civil war between the House of Lancaster, Henry's side, and the House of York. Henry was captured, deposed, restored, and captured again. A royal figurehead whose fate was determined entirely by whichever side held military advantage. In 1461, the Yorkist leader Edward, Duke of York, seized the throne as Edward IV after defeating the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton. Henry fled into hiding with Margaret, spending years in exile or on the run. In 1470, an unlikely alliance between Margaret and Edward IV's former ally, Richard Neville the Kingmaker, briefly restored Henry to the throne. But the restoration was hollow. Real power remained with Warwick and Margaret. It all came crashing down the following year. In April 1471, Edward IV returned from exile, defeated and killed Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, and crushed the Lancastrian forces at Tewkesbury in May. Margaret was captured, and her son Edward of Westminster, Henry's only heir, was killed in the fighting. With his wife and son both in Yorkist custody, Henry was effectively finished as a political force. On the night of May 21, 1471, Henry was in the Tower of London, ostensibly under house arrest. That evening, Edward IV visited the Tower, at least according to later accounts. Officially, the chroniclers claimed Henry died of melancholy upon hearing of his son's death. Few believed it. The more widely accepted version, then and now, is that Henry was murdered, most likely on Edward IV's orders. The exact manner of his death is uncertain. Some sources suggest he was stabbed to death by Sir Richard Croft or another of Edward's men. Others claim he was quietly smothered, a method favoured for its silence and the lack of obvious marks. The question that lingers in the historical imagination, however, is whether Margaret of Anjou had any role, or, at the very least, whether her fierce political manoeuvrings indirectly sealed her husband's fate. Margaret had spent years fighting to keep Henry on the throne, often ruling in his stead when his illness rendered him incapable. She had made bitter enemies and had been the driving force behind continued resistance to Edward IV's reign. Once the Lancastrian cause was broken at Tewkesbury, Henry's continued existence served only as a rallying point for future uprisings. Edward IV's decision to eliminate Henry was a direct response to the threat his name represented, but it was Margaret's relentless defense of her husband's kingship that had made him such a threat in the first place. For Henry, the end was quiet, no battle, no public trial. Just the stillness of a locked room in the Tower, and the last betrayal in a life full of them. His death marked the extinction of the male Lancastrian line and cemented Yorkist control of England for the next dozen years. In the centuries that followed, Henry VI's memory underwent a strange transformation. The man who had been seen as weak and ineffectual in life was venerated by some as a martyr king, a pious soul destroyed by the cruelty of politics. Pilgrims visited his supposed resting place at Windsor, attributing miracles to him. But the reality of his reign was far darker. A kingdom bled dry by civil war, a monarch unable to rule, and a wife whose fierce political battles may have made his survival impossible. And just as the Wars of the Roses had been a tangle of family loyalties and betrayals, the mid-20th century would see another royal death tangled in suspicion, though the setting would be far from medieval England. In the glittering but tense court of Thailand, a young king would be found dead of a gunshot wound, and whispers would swirl about palace intrigue, romantic entanglements, and the possibility that someone close to him had pulled the trigger, or arranged for it to be pulled. His name was Ananda Mahidol, and his death would become one of the great unsolved mysteries of modern monarchy. King Ananda Mahidol, Rama VIII. On the morning of the 9th of June, 1946, the Chakri Palace in Bangkok should have been quiet, with the measured calm of royal routine. Instead, it would become the scene of one of the most shocking mysteries in modern monarchy, a death that has never been fully explained, and which still stirs controversy decades later. King Ananda Mahidol, known as Rama VIII, was just 20 years old when his body was found lifeless in his bedroom, a bullet wound in his head, and a revolver lying nearby. Ananda's path to the throne had been unexpected. Born in Heidelberg, Germany in 1925 and raised mostly in Switzerland, he was far from Thailand when his uncle, King Prajadhipok Rama VII, abdicated in 1935 amid political upheaval. At the tender age of 9, Ananda was proclaimed king. But Thailand was in the midst of transformation from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional one, and the real power was held by military strongmen. The young monarch returned to his studies in Switzerland, while a regency council governed in his name. By the time he finally came back to Thailand in December 1945, the Second World War had just ended, and the country was navigating its complex position between former Japanese occupiers and the emerging influence of the Allies. Ananda's return was greeted with public enthusiasm. He was seen as a symbol of continuity after years of war and political instability. Yet behind the warm welcome, the court was a tangle of factions. Royalists seeking to restore monarchical prestige, military leaders guarding their power, and politicians maneuvering for influence. Ananda was still adjusting to his role when his life was cut short. The official version of events is deceptively simple. The young king was found dead in his bed, the fatal gunshot self-inflicted, the revolver resting near his left hand. But from the moment the body was discovered, doubt took root. The position of the gun, the lack of powder burns, and the absence of any suicide note all raised questions. Those closest to the king described him as mild-mannered, reserved, and dutiful. He had recently been making plans for the future, including discussions about studying law at university. His younger brother, Prince Bhumibol Adulyadej, who would soon become Rama IX, later recalled that they had spent the previous evening talking and reading together, with nothing to suggest despair or intent to take his own life. Almost immediately, alternative theories began to circulate. One possibility was accidental discharge. The king was known to be interested in firearms, and some speculated that he may have been examining or cleaning the weapon when it went off. But this explanation faltered under scrutiny. The trajectory of the bullet and the circumstances of the scene did not match what would be expected in a mishandling accident. The darker possibility was murder. Who would want the young king dead? Theories ranged from personal grievances to political conspiracies. Some pointed to tensions within the royal court, suggesting that certain palace officials, or even members of the family, might have seen Ananda as an obstacle to their own ambitions. Others looked outward to the military and political elites, noting that Ananda's independent-mindedness and possible interest in reform could have threatened entrenched power structures. A particularly persistent undercurrent in these speculations was the possibility of a romantic scandal. Rumors hinted that the king might have been involved with someone whose identity or background would have caused political embarrassment. In this telling, the death was a desperate cover-up, staged to look like suicide. The absence of conclusive forensic evidence meant such whispers could never be definitively disproven. The investigation into the king's death was anything but straightforward. Initial inquiries were slow and inconsistent, and political instability complicated matters. The government of Prime Minister Pridi Banomyong, already under pressure, faced accusations from royalists and opponents alike. Eventually, 3 palace officials, 2 pages, and the king's secretary were arrested and charged with murder. Their trial was a long, complex affair lasting years, filled with contradictory testimony and procedural irregularities. The prosecution's case rested on circumstantial evidence. and the defense argued that the investigation had been compromised from the start. Nevertheless, all three men were found guilty and executed by firing squad in 1955. To this day, many historians and legal scholars believe they were scapegoats, sacrificed to close the case and restore an image of stability to the monarchy. If the official line was that justice had been done, the reality was that the king's death remained an open wound in Thailand's collective memory. For Rama IX, who succeeded his brother at the age of 18, the shadow of that day would hang over his entire reign. He never publicly discussed the details of Ananda's death, and the royal household maintained a careful silence on the subject. In the decades since, historians and journalists have revisited the case repeatedly, sifting through surviving documents, photographs, and testimonies, yet the truth remains elusive. Was Ananda's death suicide, accident, or assassination? The evidence is too fragmented, the witnesses long gone, and the political stakes too high for a definitive answer to emerge. What is certain is that his end fits a long historical pattern. A young ruler surrounded by competing factions, vulnerable not on the battlefield, but within the supposed safety of the palace. Whether the fatal shot was fired by his own hand or by someone else's, the circumstances of his death speak to the lethal intimacy of court politics, where access to the monarch's private chambers can be more decisive than any army at the gates. Ananda Mahidol's story is not one of a long, dramatic downfall like Edward II's or Henry VI's. It is the tale of a life abruptly severed, of a crown that passed from one brother to another in the space of a single day, and of a mystery that remains unsolved nearly 80 years later. And it would not be the last time that a royal death in the 20th century would carry the whiff of rumour and scandal. Just a few decades earlier, in another corner of Europe, another young king, Alexander of Greece, would die under circumstances that, on the surface, seemed absurd, the result of a monkey bite. But behind the official cause of death lay whispers of poison and political intrigue, hinting once again that even the strangest royal tragedies can carry the fingerprints of betrayal. King Alexander of Greece. In the autumn of 1920, Greece was a nation straining under the weight of war, political division, and fragile monarchy. King Alexander, a young and largely unwilling sovereign, had been on the throne for just 3 years when an event so bizarre it seemed almost comedic set in motion: his rapid decline and death. Officially, history records that he died from complications following a monkey bite. But, as with many royal deaths, the official story sits uneasily alongside the undercurrent of rumours of poison, palace intrigue, and political convenience. Alexander was born in 1893, the second son of King Constantine I and Queen Sophia of Prussia. He was never intended to rule. His elder brother, Crown Prince George, was the heir apparent, and Alexander grew up in the relative freedom afforded to a royal spare. He was educated as befitted a prince, served in the army, and cultivated a reputation for charm, though not for political ambition. His life was upended by the turmoil of World War I, and the national schism, a deep divide between the pro-Allied government of Eleftherios Venizelos and the pro-German sympathies of King Constantine. In 1917, under pressure from the Allies, Constantine was forced to abdicate, not in favour of his eldest son, but in favour of Alexander, who was seen as more pliable. This was no peaceful transition. Alexander ascended the throne essentially as a political hostage, with his father and brother exiled and Venizelos dominating the government. He had little power, serving as a ceremonial figurehead, while Greece was drawn deeper into military commitments, including the Asia Minor campaign against the collapsing Ottoman Empire. Alexander's personal life became a small act of rebellion against his constrained political role. In 1919, he married Aspasia Manos, a commoner and member of the minor Greek nobility, without the consent of his family or the government. The marriage scandalized the court, strained his relationship with Venizelos, and pushed Alexander further into isolation. He was living a life-divided ceremonial duties for the state on one hand and a quiet domestic life with Aspasia on the other. Then came the incident that would define his fate. On the 2nd of October, 1920, Alexander was walking in the royal gardens at the toy palace with his German shepherd, Fritz. The dog got into a fight with a Barbary macaque kept on the palace grounds. As Alexander tried to separate them, a second monkey attacked him, biting and scratching his legs and torso. At first, the wounds seemed minor. Physicians cleaned and dressed them, and life went on. But within days, infection set in. At the time, antibiotics did not exist, and though antiseptics were used, once sepsis took hold, options were limited. The infection spread rapidly, and Alexander's condition deteriorated. Over the next 3 weeks, he lingered between life and death, racked with fever and pain. On the 25th of October, 1920, at the age of 27, he died. The official cause, septicemia from the monkey bite. The absurdity of the event led to its own myth-making. Newspapers across Europe seized on the irony an emperor brought low not by war or intrigue, but by a garden animal. Yet, even as the comedic framing took hold in popular imagination, rumors began to swirl in Athens. Some whispered that the monkey story was a cover for poisoning, the bite a convenient explanation for an illness deliberately induced. Theories varied. One suggested that pro-royalist factions, loyal to the exiled King Constantine, saw Alexander as a pawn of Venizelos and preferred his removal to pave the way for Constantine's return. Another claimed that anti-monarchists viewed him as a weak but dangerous rallying point for royalist sentiment and engineered his death to destabilize the throne. In either scenario, the strange accident offered a perfect smokescreen. An unexpected injury, a plausible infection, and no obvious culprit. It did not help that palace politics in Greece at the time were as venomous as any poison. The Asia Minor campaign was faltering, the economy strained, and public opinion was polarized between monarchists and Venizelists. Alexander's death threw the monarchy into immediate crisis. With no direct heir, Aspasia was pregnant, but her child, Princess Alexandra, would be born after his death. The throne's future was uncertain. In the chaos that followed, Constantine I was recalled to the throne within weeks, an event that fueled suspicion among those who believed Alexander's death had been politically convenient. The restoration was short-lived. Constantine's return coincided with worsening military disaster in Asia Minor, culminating in the catastrophic defeat at Smyrna in 1922. But by then, Alexander's strange and abrupt death had already passed into the realm of historical curiosity, filed away as an oddity rather than a case demanding deeper investigation. Still, for those attuned to the patterns of royal demise, the parallels with other palace deaths are hard to ignore. A ruler whose power was limited, whose personal relationships caused friction, and whose removal served the interests of powerful factions, dies suddenly and under circumstances that allow for both an official narrative and whispered alternatives. Whether or not poison ever touched Alexander's lips, the possibility ensured that his death would live on in rumor as much as in record. Aspasia, left widowed and initially shunned by the royal family, would eventually be recognized and allowed to return to court for the sake of her daughter's legitimacy. She rarely spoke publicly about her husband's death, and if she harbored suspicions, they remained unrecorded. For her, as for the Greek monarchy, Alexander's passing was a fracture that could never quite be repaired. In the broader sweep of history, Alexander of Greece's death serves as a reminder that even in the 20th century, when monarchies were supposed to be constitutional, ceremonial, and far removed from the lethal intrigues of their medieval predecessors, the crown could still be a perilous burden. Infections might be real, accidents might happen, but in a palace where political survival was always a contest, even a monkey bite could carry the shadow of conspiracy. And as the annals of imperial China show, this was hardly a phenomenon limited to Europe. Centuries before Alexander's ill-fated walk in the royal gardens, another young emperor, Xiaowu of northern Wei, would fall victim to poison delivered not by an animal, but by the deliberate hand of his own empress, a reminder that the deadliest bites in palace life often came from the people closest to the throne. Emperor Xiaowu of northern Wei. The Northern Wei dynasty, ruling much of northern China during the early 6th century, was a state forged by the Tuoba clan of the Xianbei people, a nomadic group that had settled into the business of empire. By the time Emperor Xiaowu ascended the throne in 532 CE, the dynasty was already fraying at the edges, caught between internal factionalism, restive provinces, and the powerful warlords who were supposed to be its guardians. In such a volatile environment, a young emperor needed allies he could trust absolutely. Unfortunately for Xiaowu, one of the people he trusted most, his own wife, would allegedly deliver the poison that ended his reign and his life. Xiaowu's rise was itself a product of palace intrigue. Born Tuoba Yuanshu, he was a grandson of Emperor Xuanwu and came to power during a period when the throne had become a pawn in the hands of military strongmen. His ascension was engineered by the warlord Gaozu, who had just removed Emperor Jiyimen and needed a pliable figure to legitimize his control over the court. At first, Xiaowu played the role expected of him, but he was not content to remain a puppet. From the beginning, Xiaowu sought to assert his independence, allying himself with rival military leaders such as Yuan Tai, the formidable general who controlled the western provinces. This was a dangerous game. Gao Huan's base of power lay in the eastern heartland, and Xiaowu's overtures to his enemies were nothing short of a declaration of defiance. It was a classic imperial gamble. If he could tip the balance of power away from Gao, he might restore real sovereignty to the throne. If he failed, he would be left isolated and vulnerable. Into this already combustible mix entered Empress Gao, Xiaowu's wife. She was not merely a consort, she was Gao Huan's daughter. Her marriage to Xiaowu had been a political alliance, intended to bind the emperor to the man who had placed him on the throne. For a time, this arrangement provided a veneer of unity. But as Xiaowu's relationship with her father soured, so too did the marriage. The empress was caught between two loyalties, to her husband, the sovereign, and to her father, the real power behind the throne. By 534 CE, tensions between Xiaowu and Gao Huan had escalated into open hostility. Xiaowu fled the capital of Luoyang, seeking refuge in the western stronghold of Chang'an under Yuan Tai's protection. This move effectively split the northern Wei into two regimes, an eastern court controlled by Gao Huan and a western court under Xiaowu's nominal leadership but heavily influenced by Yuan. For Gao Huan, the defection of his son-in-law was a betrayal that demanded a response. The marriage between Xiaowu and Empress Gao could not survive this political rupture. Whether she left with him to Chang'an or remained behind is unclear in the surviving records, but what is certain is that within a year of his flight, Xiaowu was dead poisoned, according to multiple historical sources, by an empress. Some accounts identify her directly. Others suggest that a later wife or concubine loyal to Gaohuan was the culprit. In either case, the implication is that the act was carried out to neutralize Xiaowu as a political threat. The mechanics of the assassination were likely as traditional as they were effective. Poison in the imperial household was a weapon of precision, easy to conceal, difficult to trace, and capable of striking without public spectacle. A cup of wine in the evening, a delicacy from the kitchens, a medicinal tonic for his health, any of these could carry the fatal dose. Given the setting, it is unlikely Xiaowu would have suspected an attack from someone within his own quarters. Once the poison took effect, there was no turning back. The symptoms, violent stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, could have been attributed to illness, allowing the act to be disguised as natural death. In a court where gossip and suspicion were constant companions, the absence of an official investigation speaks volumes. His death served the interests of both Gao Huan, who no longer had to contend with a rebellious son-in-law, and Yuan Tai, who could consolidate his own influence over the Western court without the interference of a willful emperor. With Xiaowu's death, the Northern Wei effectively ceased to exist as a unified state. Gao Huan installed another emperor in the east, founding what became the Eastern Wei, while Yuan Tai's control over the west paved the way for the Western Wei. The dynasty that had once ruled vast stretches of northern China was now two rival kingdoms, each ruled more by military lords than by the figureheads who wore the crown. As for Empress Gao, history offers little detail about her later life. If she had indeed been the instrument of Xiaowu's death, she may have returned to her father's domain, her position secure in the east. Or perhaps she was quietly removed from the stage once her usefulness had ended. In the opaque world of Northern Wei politics, where alliances were temporary and loyalty was conditional, even an empress could find herself expendable. Xiaowu's fate illustrates a recurring theme in the history of monarchy, the fatal intersection of marriage and politics. A royal spouse could be a bridge between factions, but when that bridge became a fault line, the resulting fracture could be deadly. The emperor had gambled on winning his independence from the man who made him king, and in doing so, he placed his life in the hands of a woman whose loyalties were divided by blood and crown. And if Xiaowu's death was a product of these divided loyalties, he was not the last ruler in China to suffer such a fate. A century later, another young monarch, Emperor Shao of Lusong, would find himself surrounded by palace attendants and consorts whose true allegiance lay elsewhere. His end would come not in the open clash of armies, but in the suffocating secrecy of his own chambers, proof yet again that in the palaces of imperial China, the deadliest blows were often struck in silence. Emperor Shao of Liu Song. The Liu Song dynasty, which ruled southern China during the turbulent era known as the Southern and Northern dynasties, was no stranger to palace coups, bloody purges, and abrupt regime changes. But even in a dynasty where emperors rose and fell with alarming regularity, the story of Emperor Shao's short reign stands out, a grim reminder that the greatest dangers for a ruler often come from those living just beyond the silken curtains of the bedchamber. Born Lu Yifu in 406 CE, the future Emperor Xiao was the eldest son of Emperor Wu, the founder of the Lusong dynasty. Emperor Wu was a formidable ruler who had risen from relatively humble beginnings as a talented general in the collapsing Eastern Jin court to establish his own dynasty in 420 CE. Liu Yifu, as heir, was groomed to inherit this newly stabilized realm. But while his father had been shaped by war and hardship, Liu Yifu grew up in the security and luxury of the palace, a difference that would prove fatal when it came time for him to rule. When Emperor Wu died in 422 CE, Liu Yifu ascended the throne at just 16 years old, taking the temple name Xiao. The empire he inherited was, on the surface, stable and prosperous, with its capital at Jiankang, modern-day Nanjing, serving as a thriving cultural and political hub. But beneath that surface lay a court simmering with rivalries. Veteran ministers and generals who had served his father were skeptical of the young ruler's ability. Powerful consort families vied for influence. And, perhaps most dangerously, the imperial palace itself was filled with factions whose loyalties were mutable and whose ambitions knew few limits. From the moment he became emperor, Xiao's inexperience showed. He devoted himself to pleasure banquets, hunts, and amusements while neglecting state affairs. He relied heavily on a small circle of favorites, many of them eunuchs and palace attendants, alienating the senior officials who had been the backbone of his father's administration. Such behavior might have been survivable in calmer times, but the Liu-Song political arena was anything but calm. The real power during Xiao's reign increasingly resided in the hands of older statesmen and military leaders, particularly Xu Xianji, Fu Liang, and Xie Hui. These three had been trusted ministers under Emperor Wu, and they had no intention of letting the empire slide into mismanagement under a frivolous teenager. Initially, they may have hoped to control the young emperor from behind the scenes, but Xiao's erratic behavior and his growing suspicion of them made coexistence untenable. Complicating matters were the palace women and eunuchs whose influence over the emperor was growing. Some sources suggest that certain consorts and attendants actively encouraged Xiao's neglect of duty, either out of personal indulgence or as part of a more calculated effort to isolate him from his ministers. The palace was a nest of shifting alliances, and the same attendants who served the emperor could, with the right incentives, turn against him. By 424 CE, just 2 years into his reign, the tension had reached a breaking point. Xu Xianji, Fu Liang, and Xi Hui decided that Xiao had to go officially for the good of the state, but no doubt also to preserve their own power. They plotted a coup, knowing that success would depend on controlling the palace and the imperial bodyguards. In such a conspiracy, the cooperation, or at least the silence of the inner palace staff, was essential. The end came swiftly. In the 4th of June 24, the ministers acted. Xiao was summoned under pretense or caught unawares. Accounts vary, but in either case, he found himself surrounded not by loyal attendants but by men who had already chosen their side. The conspirators moved to depose him, and the process was carried out with chilling efficiency. He was stripped of his imperial regalia and placed under guard. What happened next was shrouded in the kind of deliberate vagueness that often cloaked regicides in Chinese imperial history. The official record claims he was sent away and then killed, with little detail. Later sources suggest he was murdered in his quarters by palace attendants, men who had served him daily, perhaps even shared jokes with him, now following orders to end his life. Some accounts imply that his consorts may have been complicit, ensuring that the coup went smoothly by keeping the emperor distracted or docile until it was too late. The method of execution was likely strangulation, a common means of quietly eliminating an unwanted ruler without spilling imperial blood, a symbolic way to avoid the sin of directly shedding the Son of Heaven's lifeblood. No public spectacle was made of his death. The aim was to erase him swiftly and replace him without unrest. After Xiao's assassination, The ministers installed his younger brother, Liu Yilong, as Emperor Wen, a ruler far more to their liking. Emperor Wen would go on to reign for nearly 3 decades, in stark contrast to his brother's brief and ill-starred tenure. For the ministers, the coup was a success. For Xiao, it was the classic cautionary tale, a throne gained by birthright but lost to palace politics before it could even be warmed. Emperor Xiao's downfall underscores a recurring reality of imperial rule. A monarch's survival often depended less on armies or decrees than on the loyalty of the people with physical access to him. In the tightly controlled space of the palace, where the emperor's food, drink, and movements were managed by attendants, those attendants could be as dangerous as any enemy general. A ruler, alienated from his ministers, surrounded by courtiers of dubious loyalty, and inattentive to the mechanics of power, was a ruler courting disaster. And while Xiao's reign was short and his political inexperience obvious, he was hardly the last Chinese emperor to fall victim to such intimate betrayal. Just a few decades later, in another southern dynasty, Emperor Fei of Southern Qi would meet a fate remarkably similar to Xiao's, undone not by the clash of armies, but by the quiet precision of a palace coup, in which women and attendants from his own household played their parts to deadly effect. Emperor Fei of Southern Qi. The Southern Qi dynasty, one of the short-lived successor states in southern China during the era of the northern and southern dynasties, lasted barely 2 decades, from 479 to 502 CE. It was a time when thrones were fragile, succession disputes were frequent, and palace conspiracies were the preferred method of regime change. In this volatile climate, Emperor Fei's fate stands as yet another lesson in how a ruler's life could be ended not by the swords of invading armies, but by the quiet maneuvering of the people closest to him, some of them inside his own bedchamber. Born Xiao Zhangmao in 440 CE, Fei was the eldest son of Emperor Wu, the founder of the Southern Qi. He grew up in a court that was both a cultural center and a political snake pit, where survival required a delicate balance of diplomacy, loyalty, and the occasional display of ruthlessness. As crown prince, he was well educated, trained in statecraft, and expected to continue his father's consolidation of power. When Emperor Wu died in 493 CE, Xiao Zhangmao ascended the throne as Emperor Fei. At the time, the dynasty was relatively stable, but the stability was deceptive. The court was divided into factions, one aligned with the new emperor, another with his ambitious younger brother, Xiao Luan. Xiao Luan was a senior member of the royal family and a shrewd political operator who had gained significant influence as a high-ranking minister. The relationship between the brothers was tense, with mutual suspicion running just beneath the surface. Emperor Fei's reign began with a show of authority. He sought to reward loyalists, maintain military readiness against the northern dynasties, and engage in public works to strengthen his image among the people. But his style of governance quickly alienated parts of the court. He was described by contemporaries as suspicious and hot-tempered, traits that made him quick to punish perceived disloyalty. This, in turn, pushed more officials toward his brother Xiao Luan, who was known for his charm and calculated patience. Inside the palace, Fei's situation was even more precarious. His household included multiple consorts and attendants, each with their own loyalties. The women of the palace were often tied by blood or patronage to powerful clans, making them conduits for political intrigue. A well-placed whisper or a seemingly casual suggestion over tea could shape imperial policy or imperial paranoia. By 494 CE, Xiao Luan had consolidated his influence over key officials and the imperial guard. He began plotting to remove his brother from the throne, knowing that outright military rebellion would risk civil war. A palace coup, carried out swiftly and with the cooperation of the emperor's inner circle, was the safer option. The plot required precision. First, Xiaowu and his allies worked to isolate Fei from his supporters. Trusted ministers were dismissed or reassigned. Palace attendants known to be loyal to the emperor were replaced. It is here that the role of women in the plot becomes most significant. Some of Fei's consorts and attendants, either out of loyalty to Xiaoluan's faction or in exchange for promises of favor under a new regime, reportedly helped smooth the way for the conspirators. The critical moment came on the 27th of April, 494 CE. Accounts differ in their details, but the general outline is consistent. Fei was in his private quarters, perhaps in the middle of a meal or resting, when members of the coup faction, likely with assistance from those inside the palace, entered and took control of the situation before the emperor could call for his guards. The actual killing was carried out with the cold efficiency typical of palace coups in Chinese history. Strangulation was the preferred method, quiet, leaving no blood, and easily explained away his illness. Whether the fatal act was done by eunuchs, soldiers, or attendants directly serving in the emperor's household, they would have needed the kind of access only granted through the cooperation of those closest to him. Fei's death was announced as an abdication, followed by a swift burial. Xiaoluan took control as regent for the young successor, but within a year he had seized the throne outright, becoming Emperor Ming. In a final, brutal consolidation of power, he ordered the execution of many members of the imperial clan, ensuring no one could challenge his legitimacy. What makes Emperor Fei's assassination particularly striking is the extent to which it relied on the machinery of the palace itself. The coup was not a matter of armies marching or cities falling, it was a matter of attendants opening doors, guards looking the other way, and perhaps even a consort offering the emperor a final cup of wine laced with a sedative to keep him from resisting. It was death delivered not by an enemy general, but by the silent network of people he saw every day. For the Southern Qi, Fei's death was just one chapter in a dynasty already prone to violent transitions. The throne changed hands repeatedly in its short existence, with nearly every succession marred by intrigue or bloodshed. But Fei's fall illustrates the unique vulnerability of emperors who underestimated the reach of their own households. And this was not a lesson unique to the Southern Qi. Just over 3 centuries later, during the Tang dynasty, another monarch, Emperor Zhongzong, would also find his life and reign curtailed under suspicious circumstances involving palace factions and the women who wielded quiet, lethal influence. The names and settings would change, but the pattern would remain. The closer the hand that served you, the easier it was for that hand to end your reign forever. Emperor Zhongzong of Tang. The Tang dynasty in the early 9th century was a glittering empire of poetry, palaces, and power struggles. It was a dynasty that had survived rebellions, political purges, and foreign invasions, and yet its court remained a dangerous place for anyone wearing the dragon robe. By the time Emperor Zhongzong took the throne in 805 CE, the empire was still reeling from decades of factional rivalry. His reign would be one of the shortest in Tang history, less than a year, and his exit from the stage, much like his brief appearance on it, was shrouded in palace intrigue. Zhongzong, born Li Song in 761 CE, was the eldest son of Emperor Daizong. From an early age, he had been groomed to succeed his father, receiving a thorough education in Confucian classics, governance, and statecraft. He was known for his scholarly temperament and a sensitivity to the plight of the common people, a rare quality in a crown prince. But these virtues would prove double-edged, for in the Tang court, moral restraint was often a liability in the face of ruthless political maneuvering. In his youth and early adulthood, Li Song had watched his father's court become a battleground between two powerful factions. The eunuchs, who controlled access to the emperor and wielded enormous influence, and the civil officials, who prided themselves on scholarly merit and moral rectitude. The eunuchs commanded the palace guard and could make or unmake emperors with alarming ease. The scholar officials controlled the bureaucracy that actually ran the empire. The two sides rarely trusted each other, and the crown prince's alliances would inevitably determine the shape of his reign. In the final years of Emperor Dezong's rule, Li Song began to fall ill, possibly from a stroke or another debilitating condition that left him partially paralyzed. Even so, he retained his post as heir, and when Dezong died in early 805 CE, Li Song ascended the throne as Emperor Zhongzong. His health, however, was already fragile, and this gave both palace women and eunuchs unusual leverage over the new ruler. The most notable figure in his immediate circle was Consort Niu, a favored concubine who had been close to him for years. Alongside her was the eunuch Li Zhongyan, later renamed Li Chun, who controlled palace access, and a small clique of reform-minded officials who hoped to use Shunzong's reign to roll back eunuch dominance and implement long-needed administrative changes. These ministers, Wenxuan and Wang Pi, chief among them, encouraged the emperor to appoint men of their choosing and to push for policies aimed at restoring fiscal stability and curbing military corruption. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Shunzong might preside over a miniature golden age of reform. But his physical condition meant he was often unable to attend court in person, relying instead on written decrees and the mediation of those closest to him. This arrangement made him dangerously dependent on intermediaries and left him vulnerable to the same kind of influence and isolation that had claimed other emperors before him. The reforms angered the eunuchs, whose privileges and authority were now under threat, and alarmed conservative elements in the court who feared instability. Rumors began to circulate that the emperor's health was far worse than anyone admitted, and whispers hinted that Consort Niu and her allies were making decisions in his name without his full consent. This created the perfect pretext for a counter-move. By the summer of 805 CE, Shunzong's condition had worsened significantly. Whether his decline was natural or hastened by palace machinations is the subject of centuries of speculation. Some accounts suggest that he was deliberately poisoned slowly and in doses small enough to mimic the progression of his illness by those who wanted to replace him with a more pliable ruler. Others imply that his food and medicine were manipulated to keep him in a semi-incapacitated state, allowing rivals to push him toward abdication. The prime beneficiaries of his removal would be the eunuchs and certain senior ministers who opposed his reformist circle. In the 8th of August, 05, less than 9 months after his accession, Shunzong was persuaded, or coerced, to abdicate in favor of his son, Li Chun, who became Emperor Xianzong. The official justification was that Shunzong's health left him unable to govern, but the swiftness of the transition and the abrupt purge of his allies tell a different story. After abdication, Shunzong was moved to a quieter section of the palace and given the title Retired Emperor. His seclusion was near total. He had little contact with the outside world and no further influence on state affairs. By early 806 CE, he was dead at the age of 45. Official records attribute his death to natural causes, but the abruptness and the political convenience of his passing have fueled centuries of doubt. For Consort Niu, the emperor's death was the end of her influence. The new regime had little use for the former emperor's inner circle, and she was quietly sidelined. For the eunuchs, however, it was a decisive victory. They had successfully neutralized a monarch whose policies threatened their power and replaced him with one who owed his position to their intervention. Zhongzong's story is a familiar one in the annals of imperial China. A well-intentioned ruler with reformist allies is undermined by entrenched interests within the palace, and the fatal blow, whether literal or political, is delivered by those with daily access to him. His reliance on Consort Niu and his attendants, while perhaps necessary given his condition, created openings for manipulation that his enemies were quick to exploit. Emperor John VIII Palaiologos. By the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of the sprawling dominion it had once been. Constantinople, its legendary capital, was still crowned with the great dome of Hagia Sophia and girded by walls that had withstood centuries of siege. But the empire's reach had shrunk to a handful of territories in the Balkans and the Peloponnese. Its emperors were no longer masters of a Mediterranean world. They were survivalists clinging to the remnants of a fading legacy. Into this precarious stage stepped Emperor John VIII Palaiologos, who reigned from 1425 to 1448, a man tasked with holding the line against the encroaching Ottomans while managing the treacherous politics within his own palace. John VIII was the eldest surviving son of Emperor Manuel II and Helena Dragash. From an early age, he was groomed to inherit an empire in crisis. He served as co-emperor during his father's later years, traveling to negotiate with foreign powers and representing Byzantium in delicate diplomatic missions. He was intelligent, cultured, and fluent in both the art of diplomacy and the nuances of theology. But intelligence and refinement could only go so far when your empire was hemmed in by enemies on all sides and hollowed out from within by political factions. In 1425, John became sole emperor after his father's death. He inherited a realm with little money, few troops, and an ever-growing Ottoman threat under Sultan Murad II. Desperate for allies, John turned to Western Europe, hoping to mend the centuries-old schism between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches in exchange for military assistance. This was no simple matter. Union with Rome was a theological powder keg, hated by much of his own clergy and people. Yet John pursued it relentlessly because he knew that without Western aid, Constantinople's fall was only a matter of time. One part of that diplomatic dance involved strengthening ties with Italian states. In 1428, John married Sophia of Montferrat, daughter of the Marquis of Montferrat, a minor but strategically positioned noble house in northern Italy. The marriage was politically sensible, but personally disastrous. By all accounts, John found Sophia cold and unattractive, while she found the decaying Byzantine court far less splendid than she had been led to believe. Their relationship soured quickly, and before long, they were living largely separate lives within the palace. This estrangement became fertile ground for rumour. In a court where intrigue was as much a part of daily life as prayer and ceremony, an imperial marriage in disarray was a potential fault line for plots. Sophia, isolated from her family and homeland, would have had every incentive to seek allies among the factions jostling for influence. Whether she acted from personal resentment, political ambition, or under the sway of others, her name would eventually be linked to whispers of regicide. The later years of John's reign were marked by relentless diplomatic travel. In 1437, he famously led a delegation to the Council of Ferrara, Florence, where he agreed to church union in exchange for a promise of Western military aid. The decision split his subjects. Some hailed it as a necessary sacrifice to save the empire, others denounced it as a betrayal of orthodox faith. The aid, when it came, was too little and too late. By the late 1442, John was weary, ill, and politically embattled. In November 1448, he died suddenly, at the age of 46. Official records attribute his death to natural causes, perhaps an illness contracted during his travels, but rumors quickly spread that he had been poisoned. The name most often whispered in connection with the supposed murder was that of his estranged wife, Sophia of Montferrat. The theory had a certain narrative appeal: an unhappy empress, a loveless marriage, and an emperor whose death might open doors for factions she favored. Poison was a plausible method, subtle, deniable, and well within the means of someone with daily access to the emperor's food and drink. Byzantine history was rife with such precedents, from the ancient intrigues of the Roman imperial court to the palace betrayals of John's own dynasty. Yet no concrete evidence was ever produced. Sophia herself faded into obscurity after John's death, returning to Italy and living out her days far from the crumbling empire she had once been part of. Whether she truly had a hand in his demise, or whether her name was merely convenient for gossips, the suspicion lingered. In the Byzantine imagination, where political failure and personal betrayal were often intertwined, the idea of a poisoned emperor at the hands of his own wife fit all too neatly into an established pattern. John VIII's passing marked more than just the end of a reign, it marked the last flicker of Byzantium's ability to meaningfully negotiate its survival. His brother, Constantine XI, would succeed him and, within 5 years, die on the walls of Constantinople as the city fell to Mehmed II in 1453. The empire John had fought to preserve through diplomacy and compromise was gone forever. But in the shadowed halls of the imperial palace, his death remained one more entry in the long ledger of rulers undone not by armies at the gate, but by the whisper of treachery from within. And as Byzantine history faded into memory, Tang China was already preparing its own grim entry in that same ledger. Emperor Xianzong, a ruler whose life would be claimed not in open revolt, but in the perfumed chambers of his concubines, women who smiled by day, and, according to some accounts, poured poison by night. Emperor Xianzong of Tang. By the early 9th century, the Tang dynasty had already passed its peak, but was still an empire of considerable power and prestige. Its borders were smaller than in its golden age, yet its capital, Chang'an, remained a city of dazzling wealth, cosmopolitan culture, and dangerous politics. In the midst of this was Emperor Xianzong, born Li Chun, who reigned from 805 to 820 CE. He was a man of energy and ambition, determined to restore the authority of the central government after decades of military governors acting like independent warlords. But for all his political strength and reformist vigor, Xianzong would ultimately fall to the same hazard that had claimed so many monarchs before him, not the armies of rebels or foreign invaders, but betrayal inside his own palace. Li Chun was the son of Emperor Shunzong, whose brief and feeble reign had ended in abdication, likely under the pressure of palace factions. Shenzong came to power young, inheriting both his father's title and the political instability that had weakened the throne. From the start, he showed a decisiveness his father lacked. He moved quickly to reassert imperial control over the provinces, launching campaigns to rein in the semi-autonomous military governors, Hiedushi, who had carved out personal fiefdoms in the wake of the Anlushan rebellion. These military campaigns were costly and dangerous, but Xianzong's persistence paid off. Victories in the early years of his reign re-established central authority in several key regions, earning him the respect of his ministers and the fear of rebellious generals. He promoted capable officials, revived tax revenues, and restored some of the court's prestige. The dynasty, though no longer in its full glory, was experiencing what historians sometimes call the Yuan-He restoration. But success in one arena often breeds enemies in another. The eunuchs, who had been steadily increasing their influence over the court since the mid-Tang period, were wary of Xianzong's assertiveness. His campaigns reduced the power of the military governors, but also threatened the balance of court factions in which the eunuchs thrived. Moreover, his growing reliance on trusted ministers, rather than on eunuch advisors, created friction that would soon turn deadly. Like many Tang emperors, Xianzong kept a large harem of consorts, each backed by powerful family networks or eunuch allies. These women were not merely ornaments of the court, they could be political actors in their own right, forging alliances, promoting their relatives, and if necessary, removing obstacles to their ambitions. The emperor's favor was the currency of power, and the stakes were life and death. By 820, Xianzong's personal life had become tangled in the web of palace politics. Several of his favored concubines were associated with eunuch factions hostile to one another, and competition for influence over the emperor was intense. Rumors circulated that some consorts feared the emperor might elevate rivals or demote them entirely, a shift that could strip them of protection and status, and in the ruthless logic of the Tang court, possibly lead to exile or forced suicide. It is in this atmosphere of intrigue that Xianzong's final days unfolded. On the 14th of February, 820, the emperor died suddenly in the palace. The official court record stated that he succumbed to illness, but whispers began almost immediately that he had been poisoned. According to several historical sources, the act was carried out by his own concubines, possibly at the instigation or with the cooperation of powerful eunuchs. The motive, if the rumors were true, may have been both personal and political. A concubine facing the loss of favor might see preemptive action as her only means of survival, especially if supported by a eunuch faction eager to replace the emperor with someone more pliable. Poison was the ideal weapon. It could be administered quietly, disguised as medicine or a restorative drink, and the resulting symptoms could be passed off as a sudden illness. The most common version of the story holds that the poison was slipped into a medicinal decoction given to the emperor under the pretext of treating fatigue or minor illness. Within hours, Xianzong was reportedly in agony, and though attendants rushed to summon court physicians, nothing could be done. He died the same day, leaving the throne to his son, Emperor Muzong, a man whose reign would be marked by the undoing of many of his father's achievements. The court, predictably, never pursued an open investigation. Accusing members of the imperial harem and the eunuchs who served them would have risked tearing the palace apart. Instead, the official history kept to the line of natural causes, allowing the alleged culprits to escape formal punishment. This silence was not unusual in Tang history. The same tactic had been used before and would be used again whenever an imperial death was too politically explosive to acknowledge as murder. Xianzong's reign, for all its successes, thus ended with a bitter irony. The emperor, who had restored imperial authority over rebellious generals, could not defend himself against the threats sleeping in his own chambers. His death also marked a turning point in Tang politics. Under Muzong and his successors, the central government's authority weakened, the eunuchs tightened their grip on power, and the military governors once again grew restive. The brief revival of imperial strength that Xianzong had fought for began to unravel almost immediately. As for the women suspected in his death, history has left them nameless, in most accounts a silence that may be deliberate. Whether this was out of fear, political expedience, or simply the erasure of women's roles in official narratives, the result is the same. Their identities are lost to time, leaving only the shadow of their act. And yet, their story fits seamlessly into the long tradition of imperial betrayal. In palaces from Rome to Byzantium to Chang'an, the most intimate access to a ruler was often the most dangerous. A general might be kept at arm's length, a minister could be dismissed or demoted, but a wife, a consort, or a concubine could enter a ruler's private chambers with a tray of food or a cup of tea, and in that moment the emperor's life was quite literally in her hands. In fact, the very dynasty that Xianzong's family had once warred against in the north, the Northern Wei, had seen this same lethal dynamic centuries earlier. Emperor Daowu of Northern Wei, a formidable conqueror in his own right, would learn the hard way that a concubine's smile could hide a weapon, and that a ruler's greatest danger might not be the enemies he fought on the battlefield, but the ones who shared his bed. Emperor Daowu of Northern Wei. In the late 4th and early 5th centuries, northern China was a fractured land, a patchwork of rival kingdoms rising from the ruins of the Jin dynasty. Among these states was the Northern Wei, ruled by the Tuoba clan of the Xianbei people, nomadic warriors who had traded the saddle for the throne. At their head stood Tuoba Gui, better known by his temple name, Emperor Daowu, a man of ambition and ruthlessness who built an empire from the chaos of the age. But for all his military brilliance and political cunning, Daowu would ultimately meet his end not on the battlefield but in the privacy of his own palace, at the hands of a woman who had once shared his bed. Tuoba Gui was born in 371 CE into a turbulent world. The Xianbei tribes were in a constant state of alliance and conflict, both with one another and with the Chinese states to the south. From a young age, Tuoba Gui proved himself a formidable leader, uniting his people and establishing the foundation for the Northern Wei dynasty in 386 CE. His early reign was consumed by warfare against rival Xianbei factions, against the later Yan, and against other northern states vying for dominance. By the first decade of the 5th century, Daowu had expanded his territory considerably. He was a ruler feared by his enemies and respected by his allies, but he was also known for a volatile temper and a tendency toward harsh punishments, even against those close to him. Such traits could command obedience in the army, but in the intimate, treacherous environment of the palace, they could breed resentment and danger. Daowu maintained a harem of wives and concubines, as was customary for rulers of the time. These women often came from influential families, their marriages cementing political alliances, but they were also potential players in the lethal game of court politics, where favor could shift overnight and a single misstep could mean exile or execution. In this world, a woman's survival depended on her ability to navigate the emperor's moods and the factional rivalries surrounding him. Lady Lu, the concubine who would ultimately end Daowu's life, is described in historical sources as intelligent and perceptive, though her exact background is less clear. Some accounts suggest she was favored by the emperor at one time, while others hint that their relationship had cooled, perhaps due to palace rivalries or her own waning influence. Whatever the truth, by the time of Daowu's final days, their bond had soured enough that he reportedly considered killing her. The reason given in later chronicles is both chilling and ambiguous. Daowu believed Lady Lu posed a threat to him, though whether this was due to genuine suspicion of treachery or merely paranoia is impossible to know. In the dangerous arithmetic of palace survival, Daowu's suspicion left Lady Lu with only two choices: await her likely execution or act first. She chose the latter. The events that followed are preserved in terse, almost clinical language in the histories, but their implications are anything but cold. One night, in 409 CE, within the secluded quarters of the imperial palace, Lady Liu struck. The exact method is not uniformly recorded. Some sources claim she smothered him in his sleep with the bedclothes, others that she used a concealed weapon. Given the intimate setting and her proximity, either was possible. What is clear is that Daowu, the warlord turned emperor who had survived countless battles, was dead before the alarm could be raised. His guards, whether complicit or simply too slow to react, arrived too late to save him. In the morning, the palace awoke to the news that the founder of the Northern Way lay dead, killed not by enemy generals, but by the woman who had once shared his meals and his bed. The aftermath was swift and bloody. Lady Liu's act may have been one of personal survival, but it also created an opening for political maneuvering. The Northern Wei throne passed to II of Macedon, later Emperor Mingyuan, Daowu's son, by another consort. In the complex balance of court factions, Lady Liu's actions may have inadvertently, or perhaps deliberately, cleared the way for Mingyuan's succession. Lady Liu herself did not escape retribution. The new regime could not allow the precedent of an emperor's murder to go unpunished, and her execution followed quickly. Still, in ending Daewu's life, she had ensured that he would not end hers first. It was the final, brutal calculation of palace politics. Strike before you are struck. Daowu's death fits squarely into the broader pattern of monarchs undone by those closest to them. His power on the battlefield, his success in uniting his people, and his ability to outmaneuver rival states all counted for nothing against the lethal reach of a concubine's hands. In the rigidly hierarchical world of imperial China, where the emperor was the apex of authority and reverence, it was often assumed that threats came from without. Daowu's murder was a reminder that the deadliest threats could and often did come from within. It also serves as a historical bridge to other stories of intimate betrayal in the annals of empire. More than a century later, in another corner of the Eastern Roman world, Tiberius II, Constantine, ruler of the Byzantine Empire, would also be rumored to have fallen victim to poison at the hands of a wife or mistress. Across cultures, centuries, and continents, the pattern remained hauntingly consistent. The greater the power, the more dangerous the private sphere became. Emperor Tiberius II Constantine. By the late 6th century CE, the Byzantine Empire was in a precarious but still powerful position. Its capital, Constantinople, gleamed like a citadel of gold and marble, the greatest fortified city in the known world. But the empire's borders were constantly under threat from the Persians in the east, the Avars and Slavs in the Balkans, and the ever-present dangers of court intrigue within the palace walls. In this volatile landscape ruled Emperor Tiberius II, Constantine, a man who began his political career almost by accident, rose to supreme power in an age of intrigue, and, according to some chroniclers, met his death not at the hands of a foreign enemy, but from a far more intimate betrayal, poison administered by a woman close to him. Tiberius had not been born to rule. Originating from Thrace, he entered imperial service as a member of the Imperial Guard under Emperor Justin II. Known for his charm, generosity, and soldierly courage, he quickly became a trusted figure at court. When Justin II descended into bouts of mental instability recorded by contemporary chroniclers as fits of rage, paranoia, and uncontrollable weeping, Tiberius was appointed as Caesar in 574, effectively taking over the responsibilities of government, while the emperor's wife, Empress Sophia, retained her influence. Sophia is a central figure in any discussion of Tiberius's life and death. She had been the de facto ruler during her husband's illness, and when Tiberius became Caesar, she initially imagined she could keep him under her control. By some accounts, she even proposed marriage after Justin II's death in 578, perhaps envisioning a union that would cement her position as co-sovereign. But Tiberius refused her hand, choosing instead to marry Ino Anastasia, a decision that enraged Sophia and may have planted the seeds of future enmity. As emperor, Tiberius II, Constantine was remembered as generous to a fault. He reduced taxes, lavished gifts on the poor, and distributed gold freely to the army. His reign was marked by both military challenges and notable victories, including campaigns against the Persians and defensive efforts in the Balkans. Yet his open-handedness, while popular with the people, strained the imperial treasury, and his political decisions often stirred rivalries within the court. One of his most consequential acts was elevating the general Maurice to high command in the east, a man whose military acumen would later secure him the throne. This appointment was strategic. Tiberius had no surviving sons, and his daughters were potential pawns in the marriage politics of succession. He betrothed one daughter to Maurice, and the other to Germanus, a prominent noble, effectively splitting the line of succession between two powerful men, a move that was meant to stabilize the empire but instead deepened rivalries. By 582, Tiberius's health began to decline sharply. Contemporary sources differ on the nature of his illness. Some suggest dysentery or another acute disease, but there were whispers that the sudden and severe turn for the worse was the result of deliberate poisoning. The suspect in these rumors was either Empress Sophia, still nursing resentment over his earlier rejection, or a mistress who had fallen out of favor and sought revenge. In the labyrinthine politics of the Byzantine court, either scenario was plausible. Poison had a long and well-documented history in imperial intrigues. It was the weapon of choice for those who needed a clean, discreet assassination that left few visible traces and could be disguised as illness. The imperial kitchens, the physician's prescriptions, or even the emperor's own cupbearers could be suborned by those with the right influence. In Tiberius's case, his illness progressed too quickly for effective treatment, and the fact that no public inquiry was made into the cause of his death is itself telling. As his condition worsened, Tiberius summoned Maurice and Germanus to his bedside. In a dramatic and politically calculated move, he named Maurice as his sole successor, marrying him to his daughter Constantina and entrusting the empire to him. Within days, on the 14th of August, 582, Tiberius was dead. The official cause remained natural illness, but the rumors of poison persisted, fueled by the convenient timing and the number of people who stood to gain from his removal. Sophia's position after Tiberius's death was complicated. Though she had not succeeded in marrying him, she retained considerable wealth and influence. Maurice allowed her to live in comfort but curtailed her political activities, perhaps suspecting that she had indeed played a role in hastening Tiberius's demise. If the rumors were true, Sophia had not only survived the death of one emperor, but had been implicated in the death of two, her husband Justin II and his successor. For Ino Anastasia, the loss of her husband was a personal tragedy, but also a political defeat. With Maurice on the throne, her role diminished, and she eventually faded from public life. If she suspected foul play, there is no record of her voicing it. In the Byzantine court, silence was often the only safe response to suspicion. The death of Tiberius II. Constantine closed one chapter of imperial history and opened another. Maurice, the new emperor, would reign for 2 decades before meeting his own violent end, overthrown and executed in a military coup. The empire itself would continue its oscillation between revival and crisis, each ruler navigating the double threat of enemies at the borders and daggers within the palace. Tiberius's rumoured poisoning is a fitting end for this catalogue of monarchs brought down by their spouses or lovers. His life had been shaped by women of formidable political skill. Sophia, who had tried to make him her puppet or consort. Anastasia, who stood beside him in his final years, and possibly others whose names have not survived in the sources. Whether or not poison truly passed his lips in those final days, the suspicion alone cements his place in the long tradition of rulers undone by the intimate treacheries of the court. And in that, Tiberius shared the fate of kings and emperors across centuries and continents. Agamemnon in his Bronze Age bath, Ramesses III in the harem shadow, and countless others whose crowns could not protect them from the dangers that came not from armies or assassins in the street, but from the quiet, smiling presence of someone they once trusted enough to let into their chambers.